Have you ever lain awake at night, feeling the weight of these slowing years? The body that once moved so freely now reminds you of its limits. The friends and family who filled your days are slowly fading away, and in the quiet moments, a soft voice whispers, "What comes next?" You are not alone. For over 2,500 years, the Buddha looked deeply into this very fear, the fear of growing old, of losing control, of disappearing. And what he discovered was not resignation, but liberation. A way to grow old with grace, dignity, and a smile that no wrinkle can hide. In the next few minutes, I'm going to share with you 7 powerful Buddhist practices that have helped thousands of elders, just like you, trade worry for peace, fear for fearless wisdom, and aging for awakened living. These are not theories. These are gentle, practical teachings you can begin using today, in your own home, in your own heart. So breathe with me, and let's begin this beautiful final chapter together. The truth of impermanence. Somewhere in your life, likely when you were very young, you absorbed a quiet lie without ever noticing it happen. The lie was this: that things are supposed to stay the same, that the people you love are supposed to remain exactly as they are, that your own body, once it reached some imagined peak of strength and beauty, was supposed to hold that shape forever, that the good days were meant to last, and that when they did not, something had gone wrong. No one ever sat you down and explained this belief in words, and yet it lives underneath almost every modern human mind, shaping expectations, driving disappointment, and quietly preparing the ground for the fear that arrives with age. The Buddha's very first and most fundamental insight cuts directly against this hidden lie. He called it anicca, a word usually translated as impermanence, though the translation only captures part of its depth. Anicca does not simply mean that things change occasionally, the way a season changes or a fashion trend fades. Anicca means that everything without exception, every single phenomenon in the entire universe, whether it is a mountain, a thought, a relationship, a feeling of happiness, a cell in your body, or the very sense of self that you call I, is in constant motion, arising and passing away in every instant. Nothing holds still, nothing is fixed. The very ground beneath what you call yourself is a river, not a stone. This might sound, at first hearing, like troubling news. If nothing lasts, what is the point of anything? If even the self is not fixed, who exactly is living this life? These are natural questions, and they deserve to be taken seriously rather than brushed aside with a comforting slogan. But sit with the teaching a little longer, and something remarkable begins to happen. The very fact that once felt like a threat begins to reveal itself as a liberation. Consider what it would actually mean if things did not change. If your body at 25 stayed exactly as it was forever, held in place by some strange enchantment, you would never develop the wisdom that comes with decades of lived experience. If a difficult emotion, a wave of grief or anger or fear, never passed, you would be trapped inside it eternally, with no possibility of relief. If a painful relationship or a harmful situation could never shift, there would be no room for healing, no room for growth, no room for anything new to enter your life at all. The very changeability that terrifies us when we think about losing youth is the same quality that allows suffering to end, that allows wounds to heal, that allows a child to become an adult, that allows a grieving heart to eventually find joy again. Impermanence, then, is not simply the villain that steals your youth. It is the very mechanism that makes life possible at all. A universe without change would be a universe frozen in whatever state it happened to be in, whether that state was pleasant or painful, and there would be no escape from either. It is precisely because nothing is fixed that suffering can be transformed, that ignorance can become wisdom, that fear can become courage, that a frightened person clutching at a mirror can, with practice, become a person who meets their reflection with quiet acceptance and even tenderness. The trouble is not that things change. The trouble is that the untrained mind insists on treating change as an insult, as an injustice, as something that should not be happening. This insistence is the true source of suffering that the Buddha pointed to in his teaching on the nature of dissatisfaction, which he called dukkha. Dukkha does not arise simply because the body ages. Dukkha arises because the mind expects the body not to age and then experiences the natural unfolding of time as a personal wound. The wrinkle itself does not suffer. The gray hair itself does not suffer. It is the story wrapped around the wrinkle, the interpretation layered onto the gray hair, the comparison to an imagined self that should have stayed young forever, that produces the ache in the chest and the tightness in the throat. This is worth pausing on, because it is easy to misunderstand as simply another way of saying, just think positively and your suffering will disappear. That is not what is being offered here. The teaching of impermanence is not a trick to convince you that aging feels good. It does not deny that there is real loss involved in growing older. The loss of certain physical abilities, the loss of people who have died, the loss of a body that once moved without pain. These losses are real, and a mature spiritual practice never asks you to pretend that they are not. What the teaching of impermanence does is far more honest and, in the end, far more comforting. It asks you to see clearly that loss and change are not exceptions to the rule of existence, breakdowns in an otherwise stable system. They are the rule itself. They are what existence has always been doing, since long before you were born, and what it will continue doing long after you are gone. You are not being singled out by aging. You are simply witnessing, in your own particular body and your own particular years, the same law that governs every star, every ocean, every forest, and every living creature that has ever drawn breath. There is a traditional image used in Buddhist teaching to illustrate this truth, the image of a flame passed from one candle to another. Look closely at a candle flame and ask yourself, is this the same flame from moment to moment? In truth, the flame you see now is not identical to the flame you saw a second ago. It is a continuous process of combustion, oxygen and wax being consumed and transformed into light and heat, moment after moment, so quickly that it appears to be one single unchanging thing, when in reality it is an ever-renewing event. This is exactly how Buddhist teaching asks you to see your own body and your own self, not as a fixed object that once was young and is now old, as though a single unchanging thing has been damaged over time, but as a continuous process, renewing itself moment by moment, cell by cell, thought by thought, always in motion, never solid, never still. When you begin to see yourself this way, something shifts in how aging feels from the inside. You stop comparing your current self to some fixed ideal self from decades ago, as though that younger version were the real you, and this older version is a diminished counterfeit. Instead, you begin to recognize that the person you were at 20 and the person you are now are both temporary expressions of the same ongoing process, neither one more real or more valid than the other. The 20-year-old was not more truly you. The person you are now is not less truly you. Both are simply where the river of your life happened to be flowing at a particular moment in time. This recognition does not happen instantly through reading a paragraph. It happens through practice, through returning again and again to a direct, embodied awareness of change as it is actually happening, rather than as an abstract idea. One of the most powerful ways to cultivate this awareness is through simple, sustained attention to the body itself. Sit quietly, close your eyes, and bring your attention to any part of your body, perhaps your hands resting in your lap. Notice the subtle sensations there, the warmth, the slight tingling, the pressure of one hand against the other. Stay with this for several minutes, and you will begin to notice that the sensations are not actually still. They shift, they pulse, they fade and reappear in slightly different form. What felt like a solid, unchanging hand a moment ago reveals itself, under close attention, to be a field of constantly changing sensation. This is not a special trick reserved for advanced meditators. It is available to anyone willing to sit still long enough to look closely. The same kind of attention can be brought to emotions. When sadness arises, rather than immediately telling yourself the familiar story that this sadness will last forever and define your existence, try instead to simply observe it as a physical and emotional event, arising, staying for a while, and then, if you do not feed it with more fearful thinking, beginning to fade. Emotions, like all phenomena, are impermanent. They arise due to causes and conditions, and they pass away when those causes and conditions change, whether through the passage of time, through a shift in circumstances, or through the simple fact that no mental state, however intense, can remain at full strength forever. Anger that felt unbearable an hour ago softens. Grief that felt like it would never lift eventually becomes something you can carry rather than something that carries you. This is not because you have failed to grieve properly or failed to feel your anger fully. It is simply the nature of all phenomena, mental and physical alike, to rise and fall like waves on an ocean that itself remains vast and unshaken. Bringing this same lens to the process of aging can be transformative. Instead of experiencing each new sign of age as a fresh insult, a reminder that something precious is being stolen from you, you begin to experience it as confirmation of a law you already understand and have already made peace with. Ah, there it is again, the truth of impermanence, showing itself in my body just as it shows itself in the sunset, in the falling leaf, in the tide going out. This is not a resignation born of defeat. It is a recognition born of wisdom, the same wisdom that allowed ancient meditators sitting in caves and forest hermitages 2,500 years ago to face their own aging and dying with a steadiness that continues to inspire practitioners today. There is also a subtler layer to this teaching, one that touches on the very sense of self that fears aging in the first place. Traditional Buddhist philosophy teaches that what we call the self is not a single, solid, unchanging entity residing somewhere inside the body, watching the show of life unfold. Rather, the self is better understood as a process, a constantly shifting bundle of physical form, feelings, perceptions, mental formations, and consciousness, arising together in each moment to create the convincing illusion of a continuous, solid I. This teaching, known as anatta or non-self, can sound intellectually complex, but its practical implication for aging is profound and surprisingly comforting. If there is no fixed, solid self that exists unchanged from birth to death, then there is no fixed, solid self that is being destroyed by the aging process. What is happening is not the ruin of some eternal essence. It is simply the natural unfolding of a process that was never solid to begin with. This does not mean you do not exist, or that your experiences do not matter, or that the very real physical and emotional realities of growing older should be dismissed as illusion in some careless, spiritually bypassing way. It means something more subtle and more freeing. It means that the terror many people feel about aging, the sense that I am being erased, that the person I was is dying, that I am losing myself, rests on a mistaken assumption that there was ever a fixed, unchanging self to lose in the first place. When you loosen your grip on that assumption, even slightly, the fear that depends on it begins to loosen its grip on you. Many long-term practitioners describe a very specific and tender shift that occurs as they age within this understanding. Rather than looking in the mirror and seeing a stranger who has replaced their true self, they begin to look in the mirror and see simply another moment in an ongoing, ever-changing process that has never, at any point in their life, been fixed or solid. The wrinkles are not evidence of loss, they are evidence of a life fully lived, a river that has carved its banks through decades of experience, joy, sorrow, laughter, and tears. Just as a great old tree is not considered less beautiful than a young sapling, but rather more magnificent for the storms it has weathered and the seasons it has survived, so too can an aging body and an aging mind be seen not as a diminished version of youth, but as a different, equally valid, and in many ways more richly textured expression of the same continuous life. Practically speaking, cultivating this understanding of impermanence as you age involves a daily willingness to notice change without immediately layering judgment on top of it. When you notice a new physical limitation, a joint that aches, an energy level that is lower than it once was, try pausing before reaching for the familiar story of loss and decline. Ask yourself simply, what is actually happening here, right now, in this body, in this moment? Often what you find is not tragedy, but simply sensation, simply information, simply the natural report of a body that has lived many years and carries the honest record of that life within it. The suffering is added on top by the mind's insistence that this should not be happening, that this is unfair, that this proves something has gone wrong. Remove that layer of resistance, even partially, and what remains is often far more workable, far more peaceful than the fear anticipated. It is worth noting that this teaching is not meant to produce passivity or to discourage reasonable efforts toward health and vitality. Buddhist teachers throughout history have taken good care of their bodies, eaten mindfully, exercised the mind and body appropriately, and sought medical care when needed. Understanding impermanence does not mean abandoning all effort to feel well or to live as fully as possible within the body you have. It means holding those efforts lightly, doing what is reasonable and wise, while releasing the deeper, more corrosive expectation that effort alone should be able to halt the fundamental nature of existence. You can care for your knees without demanding that they never age. You can nourish your mind without insisting that memory never falter. Effort and acceptance are not opposites here. They work together, each supporting the other. Effort addressing what can be reasonably addressed, and acceptance holding what cannot be changed with grace rather than resistance. As you continue to sit with this first practice, notice how it begins to color other areas of your life beyond the purely physical. Relationships change, friends move away or pass on, children grow up and build their own separate lives, careers end, roles that once defined your days, parent of young children, active professional, vigorous athlete, shift and dissolve, making way for new roles that have not yet fully revealed themselves. Each of these changes can be met with the same resistance that meets physical aging, the same insistence that things should have stayed the same, or they can be met with the same quiet recognition, impermanence, showing itself again, exactly as it always has, exactly as the Buddha described so long ago. This does not mean these transitions are painless. Grief is a real and appropriate response to real loss, and Buddhist teaching does not ask you to suppress grief or pretend that loss does not hurt. What it offers instead is a wider context within which grief can move through you rather than becoming permanently lodged within you. When you understand deeply that change is the nature of all things, grief becomes something you can walk through, trusting that it too, like all phenomena, will shift and transform over time, rather than something you must fight against or permanently avoid. The truth of impermanence, then, is not a grim philosophical statement meant to induce despair about the shortness of life. It is, properly understood, one of the most liberating teachings available to a human being facing the passage of years. It removes the false expectation that youth was supposed to last forever, an expectation that, when left unexamined, guarantees suffering the moment that expectation meets reality. It reveals the aging body not as a betrayal, but as an honest unfolding of a law that governs the entire universe. A law that connects your own personal experience of growing older to the falling of autumn leaves, the waning of the moon, the slow erosion of mountains into sand. And it opens the possibility of meeting each new stage of life, not with dread, but with the same quiet curiosity and respect you might bring to watching a sunset, knowing that its beauty is inseparable from its passing. In the chapters that follow, this foundational understanding of impermanence will support each of the other practices, because letting go, presence, compassion, facing death, freedom from craving, and equanimity all depend, in one way or another, on having first made peace with the simple, undeniable fact that nothing stays the same. Carry this teaching with you as you continue. Return to it whenever fear about aging arises. Remind yourself, gently and without harshness, that what you are experiencing is not a personal failure or an unfair punishment, but simply the ancient, universal, and ultimately liberating truth of impermanence, showing itself once again in the particular and precious life that is yours. The practice of letting go there is an old story told in Buddhist teaching circles about a man crossing a river. He needs a raft to get across, so he gathers branches and vines, builds a sturdy raft, and successfully crosses to the other side. Once he reaches the far bank, he faces a choice. He could, out of gratitude for what the raft did for him, decide to carry it on his back for the rest of his journey, dragging its weight through forests and over mountains for the remainder of his life. Or he could recognize that the raft served its purpose, thank it in his heart, and set it down, walking onward unburdened. The Buddha used this story to teach that even his own teachings were meant to be used and then released, not clung to as permanent possessions. But the deeper lesson within the story touches something even more fundamental to human suffering: the tendency to keep carrying things long after they have served their purpose, long after the river has already been crossed. Growing older is, in many ways, an extended lesson in exactly this kind of carrying and releasing. Across a lifetime, a person accumulates identities, roles, possessions, images of themselves, and expectations about how life is supposed to unfold. A young athlete builds an identity around physical prowess. A young professional builds an identity around ambition and career advancement. A parent of young children builds an identity around being needed every single day, every single hour, by small people who cannot yet care for themselves. Each of these identities is real and valuable in its season. The trouble begins when the season changes, as it always eventually does, and the person continues clutching the raft long after the river has been crossed. This clutching is what Buddhist teaching calls attachment, and it lies at the very root of the suffering associated with aging. It is not aging itself that hurts most deeply. It is the desperate grip on a former identity, a former body, a former set of circumstances that no longer matches present reality. The retired executive who cannot stop mourning the loss of his title suffers not simply because he lost a job, but because he has not yet set down the raft of that identity to build a new relationship with this stage of life. The parent whose children have grown and moved away suffers most acutely, not simply because the house is quieter, but because she has not yet released her grip on the specific shape her purpose used to take, leaving her unable to see the many other shapes purpose might now take. Letting go, in the Buddhist sense, is often misunderstood as a kind of cold detachment, a withdrawal from caring about anything at all. This misunderstanding causes many people to resist the teaching, fearing that letting go means becoming numb, indifferent, or emotionally distant from the very things that make life meaningful. Nothing could be further from the truth of authentic Buddhist practice. Letting go does not mean ceasing to love your children, your work, your body, or your life. It means loving all of these fully, while holding them with open hands, rather than a closed fist. It means engaging completely with each stage of life, while remaining willing to release that stage when its natural time has passed, making room for whatever comes next, rather than standing rigid at the riverbank, refusing to move forward because you cannot bear to leave the raft behind. Consider the natural world for a moment, since Buddhist teaching so often draws its clearest lessons from nature rather than abstract argument. A tree does not cling to its leaves in autumn out of some misguided loyalty to summer. It releases them, fully and without resistance, understanding on some deep biological level that holding on to dead leaves through the winter would only exhaust its limited resources and prevent new growth in the spring. The releasing is not a tragedy for the tree. It is precisely what allows the tree to survive winter and flourish again when conditions change. Human beings, unlike trees, have minds capable of resisting this natural rhythm, capable of clinging to the metaphorical leaves of youth, status, physical ability, and former identity long after their season has passed. And this clinging, more than the passage of time itself, is often the true source of suffering in later life. The practice of letting go begins with honest inventory. What are you still carrying that no longer serves you? This is a question worth sitting with quietly, perhaps in meditation, perhaps in a journal, perhaps simply during a long walk. Are you still measuring your worth by a physical standard that belonged to your 20s or 30s, judging your current body against a version of yourself that no longer exists, and, if you are honest, never needed to be the sole measure of your value even then? Are you still clinging to a professional identity that gave you purpose for decades, but no longer matches your daily reality now that you have retired or slowed down? Are you still gripping tightly to a role as the primary caretaker of children who have now grown into capable adults who no longer need you in the same way, leaving you resentful of their independence rather than proud of it? Are you still holding on to grievances from decades past, replaying old wounds and old arguments as though they were still happening, carrying the weight of resentment through years that could otherwise be lighter and freer? Each of these forms of clinging, examined honestly, reveals itself as a raft still being carried long after the river has been crossed. The practice is not to violently rip these things away from yourself in a single dramatic gesture, but to gently, patiently, and repeatedly notice the clinging as it arises, and to practice setting it down, again and again, the way a meditator returns attention to the breath, again and again without frustration, each time the mind wanders. Letting go is not usually a single event. It is a continuous practice, a daily returning to openness whenever the grip tightens once more. One of the most practical entry points into this practice is through the relationship with the physical body itself. As the body ages, it inevitably becomes less capable of certain things it once did with ease. This can be experienced as a series of small deaths, each limitation a fresh grief, unless it is instead experienced as an invitation to practice letting go in real time. When the knees no longer allow the long hikes once taken for granted, there is a choice available in that moment. One path leads toward bitterness, endless comparison to the past, and a refusal to find any value in what remains possible now. The other path leads toward a gentle acknowledgement, yes, this is different now, and toward curiosity about what new forms of movement, connection with nature, and physical joy might still be available within the body's current capacity. This is not toxic positivity that denies the real loss of capability. It is a mature response that honors the loss while remaining open to whatever remains, rather than becoming so fixated on what is gone that the very real gifts of the present moment go entirely unnoticed. The same practice applies to relationships that have changed shape over time. Many people approaching or moving through older age find themselves grieving not just the physical changes of their own bodies, but the changing shape of their social world. Friends move away or pass on. Adult children build their own families and have less time available. The wide social circle of a career, full of daily colleagues and casual acquaintances, narrows considerably after retirement. This narrowing can feel like a form of abandonment if experienced through the lens of clinging, as though the world is deliberately withdrawing its attention and care. But it can also be experienced through the practice of letting go as a natural and expected transition, one that invites a person to cultivate new forms of connection appropriate to this stage of life, rather than desperately trying to recreate the exact social configuration of decades past. It is worth being honest here about the difference between healthy letting go and unhealthy suppression, because this distinction matters greatly and is often confused. Healthy letting go involves fully feeling the grief, disappointment, or loss associated with a change, allowing those emotions their full expression, and then, having honored them, gradually opening the hands to release the grip on how things used to be. Unhealthy suppression involves pretending the loss does not hurt, forcing a fake smile over genuine pain, and burying grief so deeply that it resurfaces later in the body as illness, in relationships as unexplained irritability, or in the mind as a persistent low-grade sadness whose source is never acknowledged. Buddhist practice, at its best, never asks a person to bypass genuine feeling. It asks a person to feel fully and then release fully, rather than either suppressing the feeling or clinging to it indefinitely, refusing to let it move through and eventually transform. A useful image for this process comes from traditional teaching on the nature of clouds passing through open sky. The sky itself is never damaged by the clouds that pass through it, whether those clouds are light and wispy or dark and heavy with storm. The sky simply allows the clouds to arise, to move across its vastness, and eventually to dissipate, all without the sky itself being altered in its essential openness. Emotions and attachments can be approached the same way. A wave of grief about aging, about lost capability, about friends who have died, about a body that no longer moves the way it once did, can be allowed to arise fully, to be fully felt and witnessed, and then, like a cloud, to pass through and dissipate, leaving the underlying awareness, the sky of your being, undamaged and open, ready to witness whatever arises next. This practice of letting go extends even to the very sense of identity itself, touching the deeper teaching on non-self discussed in the first chapter of this journey. Many people spend the first half of life building an identity, accumulating roles, achievements, and self-images with great effort and no small amount of anxiety about whether that identity is impressive enough, successful enough, admired enough. The later years of life offer, whether welcomed or not, an opportunity to begin releasing the grip on that carefully built identity, discovering underneath it something more spacious, less defined by external markers, and in many ways, more peaceful. This is not a loss of self in any frightening sense. It is closer to a homecoming, a return to a simpler and more essential way of being that existed before all the roles and titles were added on top, and that will remain even after they have all, one by one, been set down. Practically speaking, the practice of letting go can be cultivated through simple daily exercises. One such exercise involves sitting quietly and bringing to mind something you are currently gripping tightly, whether a physical limitation you resent, a role you are struggling to release, or a grievance from the past that you continue to carry. Notice where in the body this gripping shows up, perhaps as tension in the shoulders, tightness in the jaw, or a knot in the stomach. Breathe into that area of tension, and on the exhale, imagine, quite literally, opening the hands that have been metaphorically clenched around this attachment. This does not need to produce an instant, dramatic release. Often the practice simply plants a seed, a small moment of loosening that, repeated daily over weeks and months, gradually softens a grip that may have been tightening for years or even decades. Another practical approach involves consciously choosing, on a regular basis, to give something away, whether a physical possession that no longer serves you, an old grudge you have decided to release through a conversation, or simply through internal forgiveness, or an outdated belief about who you are supposed to be at this stage of life. Each small act of giving away, of releasing, builds the muscle of letting go, making it easier to release the larger attachments that arise naturally as life continues to unfold and change. There is a particular tenderness available to those who practice letting go skillfully as they age, a quality often observed in elders who have done this inner work across many years. Such people tend to have a lightness about them, an ease that younger people sometimes find puzzling, given how much these elders have lost across their long lives: friends, physical capability, sometimes even a spouse of many decades. And yet this lightness is not naivety or lack of feeling. It is the fruit of a lifetime spent practicing the raft story again and again, crossing river after river, and each time, upon reaching the far shore, choosing to set the raft down rather than carrying its accumulated weight forward. Such elders often report feeling, paradoxically, more free in their later years than they did in the anxious, achievement-driven years of midlife, precisely because they have released so many of the burdens that once weighed so heavily upon them. This is perhaps the deepest promise contained within the practice of letting go, that release, rather than diminishing life, actually makes more room for it. Each attachment set down creates space for something new to enter, whether that something is a new form of joy appropriate to this stage of life, a deeper capacity for presence with loved ones, or simply a quieter, more spacious relationship with one's own mind. The river you are crossing right now, whatever stage of aging you find yourself in, does not require you to carry every raft you have ever built. It only requires you to keep walking, unburdened, toward whatever comes next, trusting that when the next river appears, you will know how to build precisely the raft that particular crossing requires, without needing to drag the old ones behind you. As you move forward into the practices that follow, particularly the practice of mindful presence explored next, carry with you this understanding of letting go, not as a single dramatic renunciation, but as a gentle, ongoing willingness to open the hands whenever they have unconsciously closed around something the present moment no longer requires you to hold. The power of mindful presence. Fear about aging almost never lives in the present moment. Notice this carefully, because it is one of the most useful observations a person can make about the nature of anxiety in general and the fear of growing old in particular. When you feel afraid about aging, examine closely what your mind is actually doing in that moment. Almost without exception, you will find that the mind has traveled somewhere else, either backward into memory, mourning a body or a life that used to exist, or forward into imagination, dreading a future of decline, illness, dependency, or death that has not yet arrived and may never arrive in the exact form imagined. The present moment itself, examined honestly and directly, is rarely as terrifying as the mental images of past and future that the mind constructs around it. This observation forms the foundation of the third practice, the cultivation of mindful presence, which in Buddhist tradition is called sati, often translated simply as mindfulness. Mindfulness is not a vague New Age concept, borrowed loosely from Eastern philosophy and stripped of its depth. It is a precise, well-developed practice with a long history, referring to the deliberate, non-judgmental attention to present moment experience, whether that experience is a physical sensation, an emotion, a thought, or a perception arising through the senses. The practice sounds simple when described in a single sentence, and in some ways it is simple, but its effects on the fear of aging can be genuinely profound when practiced consistently over time. Consider what actually happens when someone lies awake at 3 in the morning, gripped by fear about growing old. The body in that moment is almost always fine. The heart is beating steadily. The lungs are drawing breath without difficulty. The room is quiet and safe. And yet the mind is elsewhere entirely, replaying a doctor's comment from years ago, rehearsing an imagined future scene of frailty and dependence, comparing the present situation unfavorably to a remembered past that has already ended and cannot be returned to. The suffering in this moment is not coming from present reality. It is coming entirely from the mind's activity, its habitual tendency to time travel into painful territories of memory and anticipation, dragging the emotional weight of those imagined scenes back into the present body, which then responds as though the imagined threat were actually happening right now, tightening muscles, racing the heart, flooding the system with stress hormones in response to a story rather than an actual event. Mindfulness practice interrupts this pattern by training attention to return, gently and repeatedly, to what is actually happening in the present moment, rather than what the mind imagines might happen in the future or what it remembers happening in the past. This return to the present is not a form of denial or avoidance. It does not mean refusing to think about the future or pretending the past never happened. Planning for the future and learning from the past both have their place and their value. What mindfulness addresses is the compulsive, anxious, repetitive quality of thought that spins endlessly around imagined futures and remembered pasts without ever actually solving anything or arriving anywhere useful, simply generating more and more suffering through repetition. The most basic and foundational mindfulness practice involves simply sitting quietly and paying attention to the breath. This might sound almost too simple to address something as significant as the fear of aging, but its simplicity is precisely its strength. The breath is always available, always happening in the present moment, and cannot be experienced in the past or future, only right now. By anchoring attention to the sensation of breath entering and leaving the body, a practitioner trains the mind to return again and again to present reality, gently escorting attention away from anxious mental spinning each time it wanders, without harshness or self-criticism, simply noticing the wandering and returning once more to the breath. Over time, this simple practice, performed consistently, begins to change a person's relationship not only with formal meditation sessions, but with daily life itself. Someone who has spent months or years training attention to return to the present moment develops a kind of internal skill, an ability to notice when the mind has wandered into fearful territory about aging, and to gently, without force, redirect attention back to what is actually happening right now. This skill does not eliminate difficult thoughts about aging entirely, and it would be dishonest to promise that it does. But it changes the relationship with those thoughts, transforming them from overwhelming floods that sweep a person away into passing weather patterns that can be noticed, acknowledged, and allowed to pass without total identification. There is a particular quality of mindfulness practice that becomes especially relevant and especially valuable as a person ages, and this involves the direct, moment-to-moment attention to bodily sensation. Many people, as they grow older, develop a fraught and anxious relationship with their own bodies, constantly scanning for signs of decline, constantly comparing present sensations to a remembered younger body, constantly bracing for the next ache, the next diagnosis, the next reminder of mortality. This anxious scanning is itself a form of mindlessness, ironically, because it is driven by fear-based projection rather than actual, present, non-judgmental attention to what is happening in the body right now. Genuine mindfulness of the body offers an alternative. Rather than anxiously scanning for problems, a practitioner learns to simply notice, with curiosity and openness, whatever sensations happen to be present, without immediately layering interpretation, prediction, or catastrophizing on top of them. A knee that aches, when noticed mindfully, is simply a sensation, a report of pressure or warmth or tightness in a particular location. It is the mind's habitual, anxious response. The immediate leap to this means, I am falling apart. This is only going to get worse. This proves I am no longer capable. That transforms a simple physical sensation into a spiral of suffering. Mindfulness practice does not deny the sensation or pretend it does not exist. It simply declines to add unnecessary layers of fearful narrative on top of what is, in itself, often a fairly ordinary and manageable physical experience. This capacity to be with physical sensation without immediately spinning into fear-based story becomes an invaluable skill as the body ages and inevitably produces more sensations that would once have been unfamiliar. Chronic pain, for example, is well documented in contemporary research to be significantly influenced by the mental and emotional relationship a person has with the sensation, quite apart from the underlying physical cause. Mindfulness-based approaches to chronic pain, now widely used in medical settings around the world, consistently demonstrate that pain, while remaining physically present, becomes significantly more bearable when a person learns to observe it with mindful, non-resistant attention rather than fighting against it with fear, frustration, and desperate attempts at avoidance. This is not a claim that mindfulness eliminates physical pain through positive thinking. It is a well-established observation that the suffering associated with pain, the mental and emotional overlay of resistance and fear, can be substantially reduced through mindful attention, even when the underlying sensation itself remains unchanged. Beyond the body, mindfulness also transforms the relationship with the mind's constant narration, the endless inner commentary that runs beneath most people's daily awareness without ever being directly noticed. As people age, this inner commentary often becomes increasingly focused on decline, comparison, and worry. An almost constant background hum of thoughts like, I used to be able to do this so easily, I wonder how much longer I have, I am not as sharp as I once was, what if something happens to me and no one is there to help? Mindfulness practice does not require silencing this commentary through force, which rarely works and often backfires, creating more tension rather than less. Instead, mindfulness practice trains a person to notice this commentary as it arises, to recognize it simply as thought, as a mental event passing through awareness, rather than an absolute truth about reality, and to choose, again and again, not to follow every thought down its accompanying spiral of fear. This distinction between having a thought and being consumed by a thought is one of the most practically useful insights that mindfulness practice offers to anyone facing the fear of aging. The thought, I am afraid of getting old, will likely arise in the mind of almost every person at some point, probably many times across a lifetime. This thought, in itself, is not particularly dangerous or damaging. What causes suffering is the habitual tendency to immediately believe the thought completely, to attach a full emotional charge to it, and to spin outward into an entire narrative built upon its foundation, imagining scene after scene of decline and loss, each one adding more emotional weight until the original simple thought has grown into an overwhelming wave of anxiety. Mindfulness interrupts this spiral by teaching a person to notice the thought as it first arises, to acknowledge it without judgment. There is that fear again, and to allow it to pass through awareness the way a cloud passes through open sky, rather than automatically following it down every branching pathway of worst-case scenario thinking. There is also a beautiful and often overlooked gift that mindful presence offers specifically to the experience of growing older. A gift that has nothing to do with managing fear and everything to do with actually enjoying the years that remain. When attention is repeatedly trained to rest in the present moment, a person naturally becomes more capable of noticing and appreciating the simple pleasures that are actually available right now. the taste of a cup of tea, the warmth of sunlight through a window, the sound of a grandchild's laughter, the particular quality of light at the end of a long afternoon. Many people spend so much of their lives lost in thought about the past and future that they miss the actual texture of their present experience almost entirely, and this tendency to miss the present moment often becomes more costly, not less, as the years remaining grow fewer. Mindfulness practice, by training attention to consistently return to what is actually happening now, allows a person to experience more fully and more richly whatever years remain, rather than spending those precious years lost in anxious rumination about a past that cannot be changed or a future that has not yet arrived and may unfold quite differently than imagined. A useful daily practice for cultivating this quality of presence involves what is sometimes called the pause practice. Several times throughout the day, perhaps triggered by a simple cue like sitting down for a meal, waiting for a kettle to boil, or transitioning between one activity and another, a person deliberately pauses for just 3 breaths, bringing full attention to the sensations of breathing, the sounds present in the environment, and the physical sensations in the body, without judgment or agenda, simply noticing what is actually here right now. This brief pause, repeated consistently many times each day, gradually retrains the nervous system to spend more time resting in present awareness and less time lost in anxious mental time travel. And over weeks and months, many practitioners report a noticeable reduction in the general background hum of anxiety that had previously accompanied their thoughts about aging and mortality. It is worth acknowledging honestly that mindfulness practice, like all the practices described in this journey, is not a magic solution that instantly eliminates every difficult emotion associated with growing older. There will still be moments of genuine grief, genuine fear, and genuine difficulty as the body changes and as loved ones are lost along the way. Mindfulness does not promise to prevent these experiences. What it offers instead is a radically different relationship with these experiences when they do arise, a capacity to meet them with presence and openness rather than resistance and avoidance, and a trust, built through repeated practice, that even the most difficult present moment experience is workable when met directly, without the additional suffering caused by mental time travel into imagined futures or painful comparisons to an idealized past. The present moment, examined honestly and repeatedly through consistent practice, reveals itself again and again to be far more workable, far more peaceful, and often far more beautiful than the anxious mind's constant projections about aging would ever lead a person to expect. This is perhaps the deepest gift of mindful presence, not that it eliminates the challenges of growing older, but that it reveals, moment after moment, that those challenges, when actually faced directly in the here and now, rather than dreaded in advance, are almost always more bearable, more manageable, and more survivable than the anticipatory fear had suggested they would be. As you carry this practice forward into daily life, notice how often the mind travels away from the present moment when thinking about aging, and notice how each gentle return to the breath, to the body, to the actual sounds and sensations of right now offers a small but meaningful relief from the weight of anxious projection. This simple, repeatable practice of returning to presence forms an essential foundation for the compassion practice explored next, since a heart that is fully present is far more capable of genuine tenderness toward itself and others than a mind endlessly lost in anxious thought about the past and future. The path of loving kindness. One of the quieter tragedies of growing older in much of the modern world is the slow creep of invisibility. A person who once felt seen, valued, and needed, whether through work, through raising a family, through an active social circle built around shared daily life, often finds that as the years pass, the world seems to look through them rather than at them. Younger colleagues fill the workplace once occupied by the retiree. Grown children build full lives of their own, visiting when they can, but no longer needing daily presence and guidance. Friends who once filled the calendar with lunches and long conversations move away, become ill, or pass on entirely, and the wide, buzzing social world of earlier decades gradually narrows into something quieter, sometimes uncomfortably so. This creeping invisibility, more than any wrinkle or grey hair, is often the deepest source of pain associated with growing older, a pain not of the body but of the heart, the ache of feeling forgotten, unneeded, and alone. The fourth practice offered here addresses this particular ache directly, through the cultivation of what Buddhist tradition calls metta, usually translated as loving kindness. Metta is not simply a pleasant feeling of warmth toward people you already love easily, your children, your closest friends, your partner. It is a deliberately cultivated quality of unconditional goodwill, extended first toward yourself, then gradually outward toward loved ones, toward neutral people you barely know, toward difficult people who have caused you pain, and eventually toward all beings everywhere, without exception. This practice, cultivated systematically over time, offers a profound antidote to the loneliness and invisibility that so often accompany the later decades of life, not because it magically fills a calendar with new friends, though it often does lead to richer connection, but because it fundamentally transforms the relationship a person has with their own heart, making that heart less dependent on external validation and more capable of generating its own warmth, regardless of circumstance. The traditional practice of metta meditation begins, somewhat counterintuitively for many people, with directing loving kindness toward oneself. This starting point often proves surprisingly difficult, particularly for people who have spent decades in cultures that emphasize self-sacrifice, humility, or simple busyness that leaves little room for self-reflection. Many people discover, when they first attempt this practice, a startling amount of internal harshness directed at themselves, criticism about their aging bodies, judgment about mistakes made decades ago, impatience with their own perceived slowness or forgetfulness. This internal harshness, often carried unconsciously for a lifetime, becomes particularly corrosive during the aging process, when the body and mind are already navigating significant change and could benefit enormously from an internal atmosphere of kindness rather than criticism. The practice itself is simple in structure, even when it proves emotionally challenging in execution. A person sits quietly, brings attention to the breath and body, and begins silently repeating simple phrases of goodwill directed toward themselves. Phrases such as, "May I be safe," "May I be healthy," "May I be at ease," "May I be free from suffering." These phrases are not meant to be recited mechanically, like a hollow mantra disconnected from feeling. They are meant to be offered slowly, with genuine intention, allowing whatever emotional response arises, whether warmth, resistance, sadness, or even tears, to be felt fully, rather than pushed aside. Many practitioners report that the phrases feel awkward or even false at first, particularly if they have spent a lifetime directing more compassion toward others than toward themselves. This awkwardness is not a sign of failure, it is simply evidence of unfamiliar territory being explored, territory that becomes more comfortable and more genuinely felt with repeated practice over time. Once a foundation of self-directed loving kindness has been established, even in a small and imperfect way, the practice traditionally expands outward, first toward someone who is easy to love, perhaps a cherished friend, a beloved grandchild, or a partner of many decades, repeating the same phrases: "May you be safe," "May you be healthy," "May you be at ease," "May you be free from suffering," while holding this person's image gently in mind. From here, the practice extends further, toward a neutral person, perhaps a cashier at a local shop, or a neighbor whose name is barely known, someone toward whom no strong feeling, positive or negative, is typically held. This stage of the practice is particularly valuable for people navigating the social narrowing that often accompanies aging, because it trains the heart to extend genuine warmth beyond the small circle of close, familiar relationships, cultivating a broader capacity for connection that does not depend entirely on a small number of long-standing relationships remaining exactly as they have always been. The practice then extends, more challengingly, toward a difficult person, perhaps someone who has caused pain or conflict across the years, a family member with whom there has been long-standing tension, a former colleague who behaved unfairly, or even, for some practitioners, a version of themselves from the past that they have struggled to forgive. This stage of the practice is often the most difficult and the most transformative, because it directly addresses the accumulated resentments that many people carry, often for decades, without ever fully examining or releasing them. Holding a difficult person in mind while offering genuine wishes for their safety, health, ease, and freedom from suffering does not require excusing harmful behavior or pretending that past hurts did not matter. It simply recognizes that carrying resentment forward, year after year, causes ongoing suffering primarily to the person carrying it, and that releasing this resentment, even gradually and imperfectly, lightens a burden that often becomes heavier, not lighter, with the passage of time if left unaddressed. Finally, the practice extends outward to encompass all beings everywhere, without exception, cultivating a boundless quality of goodwill that includes every person on earth, known and unknown, friend and stranger, along with all other living creatures. This final stage might sound abstract or even impossibly grand, but its practical effect is to remind the practitioner that they exist within a vast web of interconnected life, rather than as an isolated individual, gradually losing relevance as the years pass. This shift in perspective, cultivated through consistent practice, can significantly ease the particular loneliness of aging, replacing a narrow, anxious focus on one's own shrinking social circle with a wider, warmer sense of belonging to something larger and more enduring than any single set of relationships. Beyond the formal seated practice of metta meditation, the cultivation of loving kindness has enormously practical applications in daily life during the later years, applications that directly address the isolation that so many older people experience. One of the clearest research findings across decades of studies on aging and well-being is that social connection, more than almost any other single factor, predicts happiness and even physical health in later life. And yet many older people, feeling increasingly invisible, gradually withdraw from social opportunities, assuming that others are too busy, too focused on younger generations, or simply uninterested in spending time with them. The practice of loving kindness offers a direct counter to this withdrawal, cultivating an inner warmth and openness that naturally expresses itself outward, making a person more approachable, more inclined to reach out first rather than waiting to be reached out to, and more capable of forming new connections even in a life stage when old social structures have significantly changed. There is a particular form of generosity available to older people, one that Buddhist teaching has long recognized as a genuine treasure, and this involves the offering of accumulated wisdom, patience, and presence to younger generations. Many cultures throughout history have recognized elders as holders of wisdom, storytellers, keepers of tradition, and sources of calm perspective for younger people navigating the anxieties of building a life. Modern Western culture has, in many places, lost some of this traditional reverence for elders, contributing to the sense of invisibility so many older people experience. But the opportunity to offer wisdom, patience, and loving presence to younger people, whether grandchildren, younger colleagues, mentees, or simply younger members of a community, remains genuinely available, and cultivating loving kindness specifically toward the intention to offer this gift can transform the experience of aging from one of passive decline into one of active, meaningful contribution. This does not require grand gestures or formal programs, though such programs certainly exist. It can be as simple as offering full, patient, undistracted attention to a grandchild describing their day, sharing a story from one's own younger years when a younger person is struggling with a similar challenge, or simply being a calm, steady, loving presence in a family or community that is often filled with the anxious busyness of younger people still building their careers and raising their own children. Elders who cultivate this quality of loving presence often find that they are, in fact, deeply valued and appreciated, even when they had assumed themselves to be invisible, because their steadiness, patience, and hard-won wisdom offer something increasingly rare and valuable in a fast-paced world. It is important to acknowledge, with full honesty, that the practice of loving kindness does not eliminate the real challenges of social isolation that many older people face, particularly those who have lost a spouse, who live far from family, or who face physical limitations that make socializing more difficult. Buddhist teaching does not offer a naive promise that inner cultivation alone solves every practical, structural challenge of aging in a society that often fails to adequately support its older members. Practical steps, seeking out community groups, meditation sanghas, volunteer opportunities, or simply making the effort to reach out to old friends and family members, remain genuinely important alongside the inner cultivation of loving kindness. The practice of metta works best not as a replacement for practical social effort, but as a foundation that makes such effort more likely and more successful. Since a heart cultivated in warmth and openness naturally draws connection more readily than a heart hardened by years of accumulated resentment, fear, or self-protective withdrawal. There is also a profound way in which the cultivation of loving kindness directly addresses the fear of aging itself, quite apart from its social benefits. Much of the fear associated with growing older centers on anticipated suffering, illness, dependency, and eventually death. The cultivation of a heart filled with genuine warmth, both toward oneself and toward others, creates an internal environment far better equipped to meet these future challenges when they arise. A person who has spent years cultivating self-compassion is far less likely to respond to a difficult diagnosis or a physical limitation with harsh self-criticism and despair, and far more likely to respond with the same gentle, patient kindness they have practiced extending toward themselves in meditation, again and again, over months and years. Similarly, a person who has cultivated genuine warmth toward others is far more likely to receive support and care when it is needed, having built, through years of genuine connection, a network of relationships bound not by obligation, but by real affection and mutual regard. The path of loving kindness, then, offers far more than a pleasant meditation technique. It offers a fundamental reorientation of the heart, away from the isolating, self-protective contraction that fear so often produces, and toward an expansive, warm engagement with life that remains available regardless of physical capability, social circumstance, or the number of years remaining. This warmth, cultivated deliberately and consistently, becomes a genuine resource in later life, a source of resilience that does not depend on external circumstances remaining favorable, and a quality that, far from diminishing with age, often deepens and matures precisely through the accumulated years of practice, loss, and lived experience that only a long life can provide. As this practice continues to develop, it prepares the heart for what may be the most challenging and most liberating practice of all, the direct contemplation of death itself, explored in the chapter that follows. A heart well trained in loving kindness, both toward itself and toward others, approaches this contemplation not with dread, but with a steadiness that allows even the most difficult truths about mortality to be examined with courage, curiosity, and ultimately, a surprising and genuine peace. Making peace with death. Almost every fear associated with growing older, when traced back to its deepest root, eventually arrives at a single, final destination: the fear of death itself. The fear of losing physical capability is, underneath the surface, often a fear of moving closer to the end. The fear of illness is a fear of the process that frequently precedes death. Even the fear of invisibility and irrelevance carries within it a quieter fear, the fear of being forgotten entirely once life has ended, as though existence itself might be erased along with memory. Modern culture, particularly in much of the industrialized world, has developed an extraordinary and unprecedented skill at avoiding this subject altogether. Death is hidden away in hospitals and care facilities, spoken of in euphemism rather than direct language, and treated as a topic almost too uncomfortable to mention at a dinner table, let alone examine with any real depth or seriousness. This avoidance, rather than protecting people from fear, tends to intensify it, because an unexamined fear, left in the shadows, grows larger and more distorted than a fear that has been looked at directly, in the light, with honest and sustained attention. Buddhist tradition takes an entirely different approach, one that can seem startling or even morbid to those encountering it for the first time, but which practitioners across centuries have found to be one of the most liberating and peace-inducing practices available to a human being. This approach involves the deliberate, regular contemplation of death, a practice known in the Pali language as maranasati, literally translated as mindfulness of death. Rather than avoiding the subject, this practice invites a person to look directly and repeatedly at the certainty of their own mortality, not in a spirit of morbid fascination or despair, but in a spirit of clear-eyed acceptance that ultimately produces profound freedom rather than paralyzing fear. The Buddha himself taught this contemplation explicitly, encouraging his followers to reflect regularly on statements such as this: "I am of the nature to die. I have not gone beyond death." This may sound, at first encounter, like a bleak or even frightening thing to repeat to oneself. But consider the alternative that most people unconsciously adopt instead, a kind of unspoken assumption, held somewhere beneath conscious awareness, that death is something that happens to other people, or that it exists somewhere far off, in an indefinite future that need not be considered seriously right now. This unconscious avoidance does not actually prevent death from arriving. It simply ensures that when death does approach, whether through a serious diagnosis, the death of a peer, or the simple accumulation of years, the person meets it entirely unprepared, having spent decades refusing to look at what was, the entire time, an absolute and inevitable certainty. The contemplation of death, practiced regularly and skillfully, produces several distinct and valuable effects. The first of these effects involves a natural and often profound shift in priorities. When a person seriously and repeatedly contemplates the reality that their life will end, and that the exact timing of that ending is entirely unknown, trivial concerns that once consumed enormous mental and emotional energy tend to lose much of their grip. Petty grievances, minor social anxieties, and endless comparison with others often reveal themselves, in the light of mortality, to be a poor use of the genuinely limited time available. Many people who have faced serious illness or a close brush with death report exactly this shift, a sudden and often startling clarity about what actually matters: love, presence, meaning, connection, and a corresponding indifference toward concerns that previously seemed urgent but now appear, in light of mortality, to have been largely a waste of precious attention. The contemplative practice of death mindfulness offers a way to access this same clarifying wisdom without needing to wait for a health crisis to force the recognition, allowing a person to reorganize their priorities around what truly matters, while there is still ample time to live according to those priorities. The second effect of this contemplation involves a gradual, cumulative reduction in the raw terror that the thought of death often produces when it arrives unbidden and unexamined. This reduction does not happen quickly, and it would be dishonest to suggest that a single session of contemplation eliminates a lifetime of unconscious dread. But repeated, gentle, non-forced contemplation, returning again and again to the simple and undeniable fact of mortality, gradually familiarizes the mind with this reality in much the same way that repeated exposure gradually reduces the intensity of any fear response. A person who has spent years occasionally, deliberately, and calmly considering their own mortality tends to experience far less panic when death draws genuinely near, whether through advancing age or serious illness, than a person who has spent an entire lifetime refusing to look at the subject at all, only to be confronted with it suddenly and without any prior preparation. It is important to describe carefully what this contemplation actually involves in practice, since the phrase mindfulness of death can easily be misunderstood as an invitation to dwell obsessively on morbid or frightening imagery. The traditional practice is far more measured and far gentler than this misunderstanding suggests. A typical contemplation might involve sitting quietly, perhaps for 10 or 15 minutes, and reflecting calmly on statements such as, "My body will age, become ill, and eventually die. This is not a punishment, but the natural course of all living things. Everyone I love will also age and eventually die. This is the shared condition of all beings. I do not know when death will come. It could be many years from now, or it could be far sooner than expected. Given this truth, how do I wish to live today?" This final question is perhaps the most important element of the entire practice, because the contemplation of death, properly undertaken, is never meant to end in despair or resignation. It is meant to end in a renewed and clarified commitment to living the remaining time, however much or little that may be, with greater presence, greater kindness, and greater alignment with what genuinely matters. Traditional Buddhist teaching offers several classical reflections designed to deepen this contemplation in a structured way. One such reflection involves considering the many causes of death, recognizing that death can arrive through countless different pathways: illness, accident, natural decline, or causes entirely unforeseen, and that no person, regardless of wealth, status, or apparent health, has any guarantee of a long life or advance warning of its ending. Another reflection involves considering the shortness of human life relative to the vastness of time, recognizing that even a long human lifetime of 90 or 100 years represents an almost immeasurably brief flash within the scope of history, let alone the age of the universe itself. Rather than producing despair, this reflection, when held with the right quality of attention, often produces a kind of humble wonder, a recognition that this brief life, precisely because it is so brief, deserves to be treated as precious rather than squandered on distraction, grievance, and avoidance. A particularly powerful traditional practice involves what is sometimes called reflection on the 9 stages of a corpse, a contemplation historically practiced by monks who would sometimes meditate near burial or cremation grounds, observing the physical stages of decomposition that a body passes through after death. This practice can sound shocking to modern sensibilities, accustomed as most contemporary cultures are to hiding the physical reality of death behind embalming, closed caskets, and antiseptic funeral homes. But the traditional purpose of this practice was never morbid fascination. It was to thoroughly and completely dismantle the unconscious illusion held by most untrained minds that the body is a permanent, solid possession rather than a temporary arrangement of physical elements that will, without exception, eventually return to the earth from which it came. Contemporary practitioners rarely need to undertake such an intensive traditional practice to receive real benefit from death contemplation. But even a modernized, gentler version, simply and honestly acknowledging the physical reality that awaits every body, without flinching away from it in fear or disgust, can produce a similar loosening of the unconscious, clinging to permanence, that underlies so much of the fear associated with aging and dying. There is a common misunderstanding worth directly addressing here: the assumption that contemplating death regularly would make life feel pointless or would produce chronic sadness. In actual practice, among long-term practitioners across many centuries and many different cultural contexts, the opposite effect is far more commonly reported. Contemplating death regularly tends to intensify rather than diminish appreciation for the life that remains. Consider the simple observation that people often value things more, not less, when they understand those things to be limited and impermanent rather than infinite and guaranteed. A beautiful sunset is often more deeply appreciated precisely because it will not last, precisely because within minutes the colors will fade and the moment will be gone forever. Human life, viewed through the lens of honest mortality contemplation, takes on a similar quality of poignant preciousness, each day, each conversation, each small pleasure gaining significance precisely because it is understood to be limited rather than infinite. This contemplative practice also offers profound support for one of the most difficult aspects of aging: witnessing the decline and eventual death of parents, friends, and, for those who live long enough, sometimes even spouses or children. A person who has spent years contemplating the universal nature of mortality, recognizing that every single living being who has ever existed has faced or will face this same transition, tends to approach the death of loved ones with a different quality of presence than a person who experiences each death as a shocking, unprecedented violation of how things were supposed to be. This does not mean grief disappears or that the loss of a beloved parent or friend becomes painless. Grief remains real, appropriate, and necessary. But the contemplative understanding that death is the shared condition of all beings, rather than a random cruelty inflicted uniquely upon this particular person, this particular loss, allows grief to be held within a wider context of acceptance, one that tends to soften the accompanying anger, confusion, and sense of injustice that often intensifies suffering during bereavement. Perhaps most importantly, the contemplation of death offers direct and practical support for facing one's own eventual dying, whenever and however that moment eventually arrives. Buddhist teaching has historically placed enormous emphasis on the quality of mind present at the moment of death, understanding this final transition as an event of profound significance, whether understood literally within traditional teachings on rebirth or understood more broadly as simply the final chapter of a single life, deserving to be met with as much awareness and peace as possible. A person who has spent years contemplating mortality, gradually loosening the grip of denial and fear, tends to approach their own final months, weeks, and days with considerably more equanimity than a person who has spent an entire lifetime refusing to consider the subject, only to be overwhelmed by terror and confusion when death finally, inevitably, arrives. It is worth acknowledging, with full honesty, that no amount of contemplative practice guarantees a perfectly peaceful death, free from all fear or difficulty. Dying remains, for most human beings, one of the most challenging transitions a life can contain, and even experienced practitioners often report moments of fear, sadness, or difficulty as death actually approaches. The purpose of death contemplation is not to promise a flawless, fearless death, an unrealistic and ultimately unhelpful expectation to place upon oneself. The purpose is to build, gradually and patiently across years of practice, a foundation of familiarity and acceptance that makes the eventual, inevitable encounter with mortality more workable, more bearable, and more likely to be met with presence and courage rather than pure, unexamined terror. As you consider incorporating this practice into your own life, begin gently. There is no need to force intensive, dramatic contemplation from the very first attempt. Simply spend a few minutes, perhaps once a week, sitting quietly and honestly acknowledging the truth of your own mortality, without drama, without despair, simply as a fact to be examined calmly, the way one might examine any other significant truth about existence. Notice what arises, whether fear, sadness, relief, or a mixture of many feelings, and allow whatever arises to be present without pushing it away or amplifying it unnecessarily. Over time, many practitioners find that this practice, initially uncomfortable, gradually becomes one of the most stabilizing and clarifying elements of their entire spiritual practice, offering a foundation of honest acceptance from which genuine peace, rather than denial-based avoidance, can finally begin to grow. This honest facing of mortality prepares the ground directly for the practice that follows, the freedom from craving explored in the next chapter, since so much of the restless craving that occupies the human mind throughout life stems, at its root, from an unconscious attempt to accumulate enough experiences, possessions, or achievements to somehow outrun or compensate for the fear of death. Once death has been faced honestly and directly, this underlying compulsion to endlessly grasp and accumulate begins, often quite naturally, to soften and release. Freedom from craving. There is a particular kind of restlessness that many people carry throughout their lives, a persistent, low-grade sense that something is still missing, that satisfaction lies just around the next corner, achievable through the next purchase, the next accomplishment, the next relationship, the next physical improvement, if only that next thing can finally be obtained. This restlessness rarely announces itself loudly. It operates quietly, in the background, coloring decisions and driving behavior, often without ever being directly examined. The Buddha identified this restlessness as one of the central causes of human suffering, giving it the name tanha, usually translated as craving or thirst, and he taught that understanding and gradually releasing this craving represents one of the most direct paths toward genuine peace, a peace not dependent on ever finally getting enough of anything, but rather a peace that arises precisely from recognizing that the entire structure of endless craving was, from the beginning, a misunderstanding of how satisfaction actually works. This teaching holds particular relevance and particular power for anyone facing the process of growing older, because aging inevitably brings a person face to face with the fundamental failure of craving as a strategy for happiness. Across decades of life, most people pursue satisfaction through an ever-shifting series of objects. First, the craving for approval and achievement in youth, then the craving for status, wealth, and security in midlife. Then, as physical capability begins to change, an often desperate craving to hold on to youth itself, to reverse, or at least halt, the visible signs of aging, to remain exactly as one was, rather than accepting the natural unfolding of a life moving forward through its stages. Each of these cravings, pursued with great effort and often significant resources, tends to produce the same basic disappointment eventually, a fleeting satisfaction upon achieving the desired object, quickly followed by the rise of a new craving, a new sense that satisfaction still has not truly arrived, that something more is still needed. Understanding why this pattern repeats so persistently requires looking honestly at how craving actually functions in the mind. Craving operates on the fundamental assumption that happiness exists somewhere outside the present moment, attached to some future acquisition, achievement, or circumstance that has not yet been obtained. This assumption feels utterly convincing while a person is caught within its grip, and yet examined honestly across an entire lifetime, it reveals itself again and again to be a kind of optical illusion. The promotion that was supposed to bring lasting satisfaction arrives, and within weeks or months, a new craving for further advancement takes its place. The relationship that was supposed to complete a person's happiness begins, and within a relatively short time, the same restless mind that craved the relationship begins generating new dissatisfactions, new desires for the relationship to be different than it actually is. Even physical youth itself, when it was simply present and unremarkable during actual younger years, rarely produced the deep, lasting contentment that its later absence is imagined, in retrospect, to have provided. This is not to say that all desire is problematic, or that a person should aspire to want nothing at all, an aspiration that would itself become simply another form of craving, the craving to be free of craving, chasing its own tail in an endless loop. Buddhist teaching draws an important and often overlooked distinction between healthy aspiration and unhealthy craving. Healthy aspiration involves working skillfully toward genuinely beneficial goals, cultivating health, nurturing relationships, developing wisdom and compassion, contributing meaningfully to one's community, all while holding these efforts with a relatively light and flexible grip, capable of adjusting to changing circumstances without collapsing into despair if a particular outcome does not materialize exactly as hoped. Unhealthy craving, by contrast, involves a desperate, clinging quality, an insistence that happiness is entirely contingent upon obtaining a specific outcome, accompanied by significant suffering whenever that outcome remains elusive or, once obtained, inevitably changes or fades, as all things eventually do. The craving to remain physically youthful represents one of the most powerful and culturally reinforced forms of craving that a person encounters during the process of aging. Contemporary consumer culture, particularly in wealthy industrialized societies, has built enormous industries specifically designed to fuel and profit from this craving, offering an endless stream of products, procedures, and promises, suggesting that the visible signs of aging can be halted, reversed, or at least significantly disguised, if only the right cream, the right procedure, the right supplement is purchased and applied consistently enough. There is nothing inherently wrong with reasonable self-care, and Buddhist teaching does not ask a person to abandon ordinary grooming, healthy habits, or genuine efforts to feel physically well within the body they have. The concern here is specifically with the underlying craving, the desperate, anxious insistence that aging itself represents an unacceptable failure that must be fought against at nearly any cost, financial, emotional, or otherwise, rather than a natural process to be met with the wisdom and acceptance discussed throughout this journey. Examining this craving honestly reveals an important and somewhat uncomfortable truth. The craving to remain young is not actually, at its deepest root, a craving for unlined skin or a particular physical appearance. It is a craving for permanence itself, a desperate wish that the impermanent nature of existence, discussed at length in the very first practice of this journey, might somehow be suspended, at least for oneself, at least regarding this particular aspect of experience. But permanence, as established earlier, is simply not available anywhere in the universe, to anyone, regardless of wealth, effort, or desire. No amount of craving, however intense, however well-funded, has ever succeeded in halting the fundamental process of change that governs all phenomena. Recognizing this clearly does not require despair or resignation. It requires instead a redirection of energy away from a fundamentally unwinnable struggle and toward practices, such as those described throughout this journey, that actually produce genuine peace regarding the undeniable fact of change, rather than practices that merely disguise or temporarily postpone the visible signs of a process that continues regardless. Beyond the specific craving for youthful appearance, aging often brings a person face to face with the broader failure of the entire acquisitive strategy for happiness that may have driven much of earlier adult life. Many people spend their 30s, 40s, and 50s in a state of nearly constant striving, working to accumulate financial security, professional accomplishment, social status, and material possessions, often with an implicit assumption that once enough has been accumulated, a state of lasting contentment will finally be achieved. The later decades of life offer, for those willing to look honestly at their own experience, an opportunity to examine whether this assumption has actually proven true. Many people, upon serious reflection, discover that no amount of accumulated wealth, status, or achievement ever produced the lasting satisfaction that was originally hoped for. That satisfaction, when it appeared at all, tended to be fleeting and quickly followed by new dissatisfactions and new cravings, an endless cycle that Buddhist teaching describes with remarkable precision, using the metaphor of drinking salt water to quench thirst, each drink providing momentary relief while actually intensifying the underlying thirst rather than satisfying it. This honest reckoning with the failure of craving as a strategy for happiness can be genuinely liberating when approached with the right quality of attention, though it can also, if approached without adequate support, produce a kind of despair or nihilism, a sense that if craving cannot deliver happiness, then nothing can, and life is therefore ultimately meaningless. This despairing interpretation, however understandable, misses the deeper and more hopeful point that Buddhist teaching actually offers. The failure of craving to produce lasting happiness is not evidence that happiness itself is impossible. It is evidence that happiness was being sought in the wrong place, through the wrong strategy entirely. Genuine, lasting contentment, according to Buddhist teaching, is not found through the endless accumulation of external objects, achievements, or even relationships, however wonderful these things may be in their own right. It is found through a fundamental shift in the relationship with desire itself, a gradual release of the desperate, anxious, grasping quality that characterizes craving, replaced by a more spacious, appreciative engagement with whatever is actually present, moment by moment, regardless of whether the mind's habitual craving has been satisfied or not. This shift can sound abstract when described in general terms, so it is worth grounding it in specific, practical experience relevant to the process of aging. Consider the difference between two people navigating retirement, both having left careers that once occupied enormous amounts of time and identity. The first person remains gripped by craving, constantly comparing the present quiet of retirement unfavorably to the busy, seemingly important years of career and achievement, restlessly searching for new projects, new achievements, new sources of status and validation to fill the perceived void left by the ending of career life, never quite finding anything that produces the satisfaction once associated with professional accomplishment. The second person, having engaged in some version of the practices described throughout this journey, approaches the same retirement with a fundamentally different relationship to desire, appreciating the genuine gifts of this new stage of life: more time for relationships, more space for rest and reflection, more freedom from the pressures of career advancement, while holding any remaining aspirations, whether for travel, hobbies, or continued contribution, with a light and flexible grip, rather than a desperate craving that this new stage must somehow replicate the exact status and busyness of career life, or else be considered a failure and a disappointment. The practical cultivation of freedom from craving involves several interconnected elements. The first involves simply noticing, with the same quality of mindful attention discussed in the third practice, when craving arises in the mind, recognizing its particular quality of restless, anxious wanting, distinct from the calmer, more spacious quality of healthy aspiration. This noticing does not require immediately eliminating the craving through force, an approach that rarely works and often backfires, creating additional tension and internal struggle. It simply requires honest recognition, there is craving arising again, this time directed toward wanting my body to look the way it did decades ago, or this time directed toward wanting my adult children to visit more often, or this time directed toward wanting to feel as professionally important as I once did. This simple act of recognition, repeated consistently over time, gradually creates a small but meaningful space between the arising of craving and the automatic, unexamined pursuit of whatever the craving demands, a space within which wiser, more considered responses become possible. The second element involves directly examining the underlying assumption embedded within each specific craving, the assumption that obtaining this particular object or outcome will finally produce lasting satisfaction. This examination can be conducted through honest, direct questioning, asking oneself, has obtaining similar things in the past actually produced the lasting satisfaction I expected, or did the satisfaction, if it appeared at all, prove temporary, quickly followed by new dissatisfactions and new cravings? Most people, upon honest reflection, recognize a consistent pattern across their own lives, a pattern in which craving repeatedly promised lasting satisfaction and repeatedly failed to deliver it in any permanent form. Bringing this honest historical recognition to bear on present cravings, particularly cravings related to aging, appearance, and status, can significantly weaken their grip, revealing them not as reliable pathways to happiness, but as familiar, well-worn patterns that have already been tested many times before and found wanting. The third element involves actively cultivating and appreciating what Buddhist teaching sometimes calls contentment, a quality of genuine satisfaction with present circumstances that does not depend on obtaining anything additional. This is not a passive resignation or a suppression of legitimate aspiration, but rather an active, deliberate practice of noticing and appreciating what is already present, right now, in this moment, rather than perpetually focusing attention on what remains absent or insufficient. A simple daily practice involves pausing several times throughout the day to consciously notice something that is already present and already sufficient: the warmth of a cup of tea, the comfort of a familiar chair, the presence of a loved one nearby, the simple fact of being alive and breathing in this particular moment. This practice, repeated consistently, gradually retrains the mind's habitual orientation away from constant scanning for what is missing and toward genuine appreciation for what is already here, a shift that directly counters the restless, dissatisfied quality that characterizes unexamined craving. It is worth being honest about the fact that freedom from craving is not an achievement that, once reached, remains permanently secure. Craving, like all mental patterns, tends to arise repeatedly throughout life, particularly during times of stress, uncertainty, or significant transition, and the aging process itself, involving as it does so much genuine change and uncertainty, provides ample opportunity for craving to reassert itself again and again. The practice, therefore, is not a one-time achievement, but an ongoing, lifelong cultivation, a continuous returning to mindful awareness of craving as it arises, continuous honest examination of its underlying promises, and continuous, deliberate cultivation of contentment with what is already present. This ongoing practice becomes, over years of consistent effort, an increasingly stable foundation, one that allows a person to navigate even the very real losses and changes of aging without being swept away by the desperate, exhausting pursuit of trying to acquire or restore something that impermanence, by its very nature, will never allow to remain fixed and permanent. As this practice deepens, it opens naturally into the seventh and final practice explored in this journey, the cultivation of equanimity, a settled, spacious peace of mind capable of remaining stable regardless of whether circumstances are pleasant or unpleasant, whether health is present or absent, whether craving has been satisfied or remains unfulfilled. This equanimity represents, in many respects, the culmination of all the practices explored throughout this journey, the fruit that ripens when impermanence has been understood, when attachment has been gradually released, when presence has been cultivated, when the heart has been opened through loving kindness, when death has been faced honestly, and when the restless pursuit of craving has been recognized for what it truly is. The stillness of equanimity. Imagine, for a moment, a great mountain standing through the changing seasons. In spring, gentle rains fall upon its slopes, and wildflowers bloom across its lower reaches. In summer, the sun beats down with full intensity, and hikers climb its trails in search of expansive views. In autumn, storms sometimes sweep across its face, winds howling, lightning cracking against its peak. In winter, heavy snow blankets everything, and the mountain stands silent beneath a thick white covering that will eventually melt away when spring returns once more. Through all of these dramatically different conditions, sunshine and storm, warmth and freezing cold, the mountain itself remains fundamentally unmoved. Its essential nature, its solidity, its position on the earth, does not change according to whichever season happens to be passing through. This image, used often in Buddhist teaching, points directly toward the quality of equanimity, the seventh and final practice explored in this journey, a quality of mind that can hold both pleasant and unpleasant experience with the same fundamental steadiness, neither swept away by joy nor shattered by sorrow, neither desperately grasping at pleasant circumstances nor violently resisting unpleasant ones. Equanimity, known in the Pali language as upekkha, is often misunderstood, particularly by those encountering Buddhist teaching for the first time, as a kind of emotional flatness or indifference, a suppression of genuine feeling in favor of a detached, perhaps even cold neutrality toward life's experiences. This misunderstanding could not be further from the actual quality that authentic equanimity represents. A person who has genuinely cultivated equanimity does not feel less than others. In many respects, such a person feels more fully and more completely than someone whose emotional life remains dominated by anxious grasping and fearful resistance, because equanimity creates the spacious internal conditions within which emotions, whether joyful or sorrowful, can be felt fully and completely, without the additional layer of panic, resistance, or desperate clinging that so often accompanies unexamined emotional experience. The mountain does not fail to experience the storm. It simply does not lose its fundamental stability because of the storm's presence. This distinction matters enormously for anyone approaching the process of aging, because growing older inevitably brings both genuine joys and genuine sorrows, often in close proximity to one another, sometimes even simultaneously. There is real joy available in the later decades of life, the deepening of long-term relationships, the particular satisfaction of hard-won wisdom, the tenderness of watching grandchildren grow, the freedom that can come with release from earlier ambitions and pressures. And there is real sorrow as well, the loss of physical capability, the death of friends and loved ones, the gradual narrowing of certain possibilities that were once wide open. Equanimity does not ask a person to deny either the joy or the sorrow, pretending that aging is either an unmitigated tragedy or a uniformly wonderful adventure. It offers instead a stable, spacious ground from which both the joy and the sorrow can be experienced fully, honestly, and without either one overwhelming the fundamental peace and stability of the person experiencing them. The cultivation of equanimity draws directly upon each of the practices explored earlier in this journey, functioning almost as their natural culmination and integration. The understanding of impermanence, explored in the first practice, provides the intellectual and experiential foundation for equanimity, since a mind that has deeply internalized the truth that all phenomena arise and pass away is far less likely to be shattered when a particular pleasant or unpleasant circumstance eventually changes, as all circumstances inevitably do. The practice of letting go, explored in the second practice, provides the practical skill of releasing attachment, a skill directly relevant to maintaining equanimity when circumstances shift in ways that would otherwise trigger desperate grasping or resistance. The cultivation of mindful presence, explored in the third practice, provides the moment-to-moment attentional stability that allows equanimity to be accessed directly in the midst of actual experience, rather than remaining merely a theoretical concept discussed abstractly but never actually lived. The practice of loving kindness, explored in the fourth practice, ensures that equanimity never curdles into cold indifference, maintaining a warm, engaged heart, even as that heart learns to hold experience with greater stability and less reactive grasping. The honest contemplation of death, explored in the fifth practice, provides perhaps the single most powerful support for equanimity, since a person who has made genuine peace with the certainty of their own mortality tends to hold all lesser changes and losses with considerably more stability, having already faced the largest and most challenging truth that life eventually requires everyone to face. And the freedom from craving, explored in the sixth practice, directly supports equanimity by loosening the desperate, anxious grip on obtaining pleasant circumstances and avoiding unpleasant ones that otherwise makes genuine equanimity nearly impossible to access. Traditional Buddhist teaching describes equanimity as one of four qualities collectively known as the divine abodes, or the immeasurables. Alongside loving kindness, compassion, and sympathetic joy, the capacity to feel genuine happiness at the good fortune of others, rather than the more common human tendency toward envy or comparison. These four qualities are traditionally understood to support and balance one another, with equanimity often described as providing the wisdom that keeps the other three qualities from becoming distorted or exhausting. Loving kindness without equanimity can become a kind of anxious, over-involved caretaking, becoming excessively distressed whenever a loved one experiences difficulty, unable to maintain the stability needed to actually offer effective support. Compassion without equanimity can lead to a kind of burnout, becoming so overwhelmed by the suffering witnessed in the world or in one's own aging body that the capacity to respond skillfully becomes lost beneath sheer emotional exhaustion. Equanimity provides the stable ground from which loving kindness and compassion can be sustained over the long term, offered generously without being depleted, precisely because equanimity maintains a fundamental steadiness that does not depend on circumstances unfolding in any particular way. The cultivation of equanimity as a formal meditation practice often follows a similar structure to the loving kindness practice described earlier, beginning with simple phrases repeated silently while holding various people in mind. Phrases such as, "All beings are the owners of their own actions. Their happiness and unhappiness depend upon their actions, not upon my wishes for them. May I accept things as they are." This particular phrasing points toward an important and sometimes challenging aspect of equanimity, the recognition that a person, however loving and however wise, ultimately cannot control the circumstances, choices, health, or well-being of other people, even those most deeply loved. Parents cannot fully control the paths their adult children choose to walk. Spouses cannot fully control each other's health or happiness. Friends cannot fully protect one another from illness, loss, or eventually death. This recognition, difficult as it can be to accept fully, ultimately offers a profound relief from an exhausting and ultimately impossible burden, the burden of believing that the well-being of everyone one loves rests entirely upon one's own efforts and vigilance. This aspect of equanimity holds particular relevance for people navigating the aging process alongside aging parents, adult children building their own lives, and peers facing their own health challenges. Many people in midlife and beyond find themselves caught in an exhausting cycle of worry regarding the well-being of aging parents, adult children, and close friends. A worry that, however well-intentioned, often produces significant suffering without actually improving anyone's circumstances. Equanimity does not ask a person to stop caring about loved ones or to withdraw practical support when it is genuinely needed and genuinely within one's capacity to offer. It asks instead for a release of the illusion of total control, an honest acknowledgement that ultimately each person's life unfolds according to countless causes and conditions that extend far beyond what any other person, however loving, can fully manage or guarantee. This release, paradoxically, often allows for more effective, sustainable care to be offered, since a caregiver operating from a place of equanimity rather than anxious over-involvement tends to have considerably more genuine capacity and clarity to offer when it is actually needed, rather than being perpetually depleted by worry that accomplishes nothing beyond exhausting the very person trying to help. Equanimity also plays a crucial role in how a person relates to their own changing body and changing capabilities across the aging process. Without equanimity, each new physical limitation tends to be experienced as a personal crisis, a fresh source of anxiety and resistance that compounds, over years, into a kind of chronic, low-grade distress, accompanying every stage of physical change. With equanimity, cultivated through consistent practice over time, physical changes can be acknowledged honestly, responded to practically when appropriate, whether through medical care, adapted activity, or simple accommodation, and held within a wider context of stability that does not depend on the body remaining exactly as it once was. This does not mean equanimity produces indifference to physical suffering or discourages seeking appropriate medical care and support. It means that whatever physical changes actually occur are met with considerably less additional suffering generated by resistance, panic, and the desperate wish that things were otherwise. It is worth addressing directly a concern that sometimes arises when people first encounter the teaching of equanimity, the concern that cultivating this quality might reduce motivation to seek appropriate medical care, to advocate for oneself within healthcare systems, or to take reasonable steps toward maintaining health and well-being as one ages. This concern reflects a misunderstanding of equanimity as passive resignation rather than active, wise engagement with circumstances as they actually are. Genuine equanimity, properly understood, supports rather than undermines skillful action. A person with genuine equanimity facing a health diagnosis does not passively accept whatever happens without seeking appropriate treatment or advocating for their own needs within a healthcare system. Rather, equanimity allows this person to engage with the situation, seeking necessary care, making informed decisions, and taking reasonable action, all while maintaining an underlying stability that does not depend on the outcome unfolding in a particular, predetermined way. This distinction between passive resignation and active, equanimous engagement is subtle but genuinely important, and it reflects the broader Buddhist teaching that wisdom and compassionate action are never opposed to acceptance, but rather flow naturally from a mind that has found genuine stability rather than being driven by either desperate grasping or fearful avoidance. There is a traditional teaching story sometimes used to illustrate this quality of equanimity, involving a farmer whose horse runs away. His neighbors, hearing the news, come to offer their sympathies, saying what bad luck this is. The farmer simply replies, "Maybe." The following week, the horse returns, bringing with it several wild horses that had joined it during its time away. The neighbors return, now offering congratulations on this wonderful good fortune. The farmer again simply replies, "Maybe." Sometime later, the farmer's son, attempting to tame one of the wild horses, is thrown from its back and breaks his leg. The neighbors return once more, offering sympathy for this apparent misfortune. The farmer again replies, "Maybe." Shortly afterward, soldiers arrive in the village to conscript young men into a dangerous military campaign. But the farmer's son, still recovering from his broken leg, is spared from conscription due to his injury. The story continues in this fashion, each apparent misfortune revealing itself to be intertwined with unexpected benefit, and each apparent good fortune revealing itself to be intertwined with unexpected difficulty, illustrating the farmer's wisdom in refusing to immediately and definitively label any single event as purely good or purely bad, recognizing instead that the full meaning and consequence of any circumstance often remains unknown for a very long time, if it can ever be fully known at all. This story offers a particularly useful lens through which to view the many changes that accompany aging. A physical limitation that initially appears to be pure misfortune perhaps, forcing a person to give up a beloved but physically demanding activity, might eventually reveal itself to have opened space for an entirely new and equally rewarding pursuit that would never have been discovered otherwise. A period of loneliness following the loss of a spouse or the departure of a lifelong career might eventually reveal itself to have created the conditions for a deepened spiritual practice, a renewed connection with previously neglected friendships, or a newfound sense of independence and self-reliance. This is not to suggest that every difficulty of aging secretly contains a silver lining that makes the difficulty acceptable or even good. Some losses remain simply and purely losses, without any redeeming discovery attached to them, and equanimity does not require pretending otherwise. But holding circumstances with the farmer's wise uncertainty may be, rather than immediately and rigidly categorizing every experience as either wonderful or terrible, permanent good fortune or permanent tragedy, allows for a more flexible, more spacious, and ultimately more peaceful relationship with the genuinely unpredictable unfolding of a long life. Cultivating equanimity in daily practice involves several concrete approaches that can be woven into ordinary life, not reserved solely for formal meditation sessions. One particularly useful practice involves pausing whenever a strong reaction arises to some piece of news, some physical sensation, or some interaction with another person, and simply asking, "Can I hold this with a little more spaciousness right now?" This question does not demand an immediate answer or an instant transformation of the reaction. It simply introduces a small gap between the arising of the reactive feeling and the automatic behavioral or emotional response that might otherwise follow unexamined, a gap within which greater choice and greater stability become available. Over time, this simple practice of pausing and questioning, repeated across countless small moments throughout ordinary daily life, gradually cultivates a mind more capable of meeting both pleasant and unpleasant circumstances with the steadiness that equanimity represents. Another valuable practice involves regularly reflecting on the shared nature of aging and change across all beings, a reflection that directly counters the isolating quality that difficult experiences of aging can sometimes produce. When facing a particular challenge, whether physical discomfort, the loss of a friend, or simply a difficult day, it can be genuinely stabilizing to reflect honestly that countless other people, across the entire world and across all of recorded history, have faced remarkably similar challenges, that this experience, however personally difficult, is not a unique punishment reserved specifically for oneself, but rather a shared feature of what it means to be a living, aging being moving through a body across the passage of time. This reflection is not meant to minimize or dismiss personal difficulty, and it should never be used, particularly by others, as a way of telling a suffering person that their pain does not matter because others have experienced something similar. Used honestly and gently as a personal internal reflection, however, this recognition of shared human experience can provide a genuine sense of solidarity and context that supports equanimity rather than isolation and despair. The cultivation of equanimity also benefits enormously from regular engagement with the natural world, an engagement that Buddhist teaching has long recognized as a powerful teacher of exactly the qualities this practice seeks to develop. Spending time observing the changing seasons, the reliable cycle of sunrise and sunset, the patient growth of trees across many decades, the steady flow of a river that continues regardless of what debris or obstacles happen to pass through it, all offer direct, embodied lessons in the kind of stability amid change that equanimity represents. Many long-term meditators report that time spent quietly in nature, whether through walking, sitting, or simply observing, provides one of the most direct and accessible pathways toward experiencing equanimity, not merely understanding it as an abstract concept, but actually feeling, in the body and the nervous system, what genuine steadiness amid constant change actually feels like. It is worth returning, near the conclusion of this exploration, to the deeper purpose that unites all 7 practices described throughout this journey, since equanimity, properly understood, is not simply one technique among several unrelated techniques, but rather the natural fruit that ripens when the other 6 practices have been genuinely lived and integrated over time. The recognition of impermanence removes the false expectation that things should remain unchanging, an expectation that, left unexamined, guarantees disappointment and resistance whenever change inevitably occurs. The practice of letting go provides the practical capacity to release attachments as they naturally come due, rather than clinging desperately to circumstances, identities, and relationships long after their natural season has passed. The cultivation of mindful presence brings attention consistently back to the only place where life can actually be lived and where peace can actually be found, the present moment, rather than the anxious mental territories of remembered past and imagined future, where so much unnecessary suffering tends to be generated. The path of loving kindness ensures that the heart remains warm, open, and connected, even as circumstances change and social configurations shift throughout the later decades of life, offering both self-compassion and genuine connection with others as essential resources for navigating aging with grace rather than isolation. The honest contemplation of death removes the deepest and most fundamental source of unconscious anxiety that colors so much of human experience, replacing avoidance and denial with clear-eyed acceptance that paradoxically produces greater appreciation and presence for whatever time remains. And the freedom from craving releases the exhausting, ultimately futile pursuit of permanent satisfaction through the endless acquisition of external objects, achievements, or circumstances, replacing this restless pursuit with a deeper capacity for contentment with what is genuinely present, right now, regardless of whether every desire has been fulfilled. Equanimity, then, represents the culmination of this entire journey, the settled, spacious peace that becomes available when all 6 of the preceding practices have been genuinely cultivated over time, through patient, consistent practice rather than through a single moment of intellectual understanding. This peace does not depend on youth being retained, on health remaining perfect, on loved ones never dying, or on circumstances always unfolding favorably. It is, precisely for this reason, an extraordinarily durable and reliable source of well-being, one that remains available regardless of what the aging process happens to bring, whether that includes significant physical decline, the loss of cherished relationships, or the eventual approach of one's own death. This is not a peace built on the fragile foundation of favorable circumstances, which by their very nature cannot be guaranteed to continue. It is a peace built on the far more stable foundation of a mind and heart that have learned, through years of genuine practice, how to meet whatever arises with wisdom, compassion, and steady, spacious awareness. It would be dishonest in describing these 7 practices to suggest that adopting them guarantees an aging process entirely free from difficulty, fear, or sorrow. Buddhist teaching, at its most authentic and least distorted by superficial popularization, has never promised a life free from pain. The Buddha's very first noble truth acknowledges directly and without flinching that suffering is an inherent and unavoidable feature of existence, present in birth, in aging, in illness, and in death, present in separation from what is loved and in encounter with what is unwanted. These 7 practices do not offer an escape from this fundamental reality. What they offer instead is a radically different relationship with this reality, one that reduces the additional, unnecessary suffering that arises from resistance, denial, craving, and fear, while allowing the essential, unavoidable difficulties of aging to be met with far greater wisdom, stability, and even, remarkably, a genuine and abiding sense of peace. Consider, in closing this exploration, the image of the elder who has genuinely cultivated these 7 practices across many years of consistent effort, an image that exists not merely as an idealized fiction, but as a living reality observed among countless dedicated practitioners across many different cultures and many centuries of Buddhist tradition. Such a person, having understood impermanence deeply, does not experience each new physical limitation as a personal betrayal, but rather as the natural unfolding of a universal law observed calmly and without excessive resistance. Having practiced letting go consistently, such a person holds the various roles, relationships, and identities of earlier life stages with an open hand, releasing each in its appropriate season, rather than clinging desperately to configurations that no longer match present reality. Having cultivated mindful presence, such a person remains genuinely available to the actual texture of daily life, the taste of food, the warmth of sunlight, the presence of loved ones, rather than being perpetually lost in anxious rumination about the past or the future. Having developed genuine loving kindness, such a person offers warmth and connection freely, both toward themselves and toward others, undiminished by the narrowing social circumstances that sometimes accompany advancing age. Having faced death honestly through sustained contemplation, such a person approaches their own eventual mortality with considerably more courage and clarity than someone who has spent an entire lifetime avoiding the subject entirely. Having released the desperate grip of craving, such a person experiences genuine contentment with what is actually present, rather than perpetual restless searching for something more or something different. And having cultivated equanimity as the fruit of all these preceding practices, such a person meets whatever arises, whether joy or sorrow, health or illness, connection or loss, with a settled, spacious steadiness that neither denies the reality of difficult experience nor allows that difficulty to overwhelm a deeper, more fundamental peace. This is not a distant, unreachable ideal reserved only for monks who have spent entire lifetimes in monasteries, removed from ordinary worldly concerns. These 7 practices are available to anyone, in any circumstance, at any stage of life, whether beginning this exploration in vigorous middle age, already well into the later decades of life, or perhaps caring for an aging parent and wishing to better understand and support their journey. The practices do not require a dramatic renunciation of ordinary life, a conversion to a new religion, or years of isolated monastic training. They require, instead, patient, consistent, honest engagement, returning again and again to these teachings, testing them against actual lived experience, noticing where fear and resistance still hold tight grip, and gently, persistently, practicing the release of that grip, one breath, one moment, one day at a time. It may be helpful, as you consider integrating these 7 practices into your own life, to think of them not as a rigid sequence to be completed once and then set aside, but rather as 7 companions to be revisited again and again, sometimes in order, sometimes in whichever order the particular challenges of a given season of life happen to call forward. Some days, the most relevant practice might be the simple return to mindful presence, gently escorting an anxious, wandering mind back to the sensations of breath and body available right now. Other days, the most relevant practice might be the deliberate cultivation of loving kindness, offering warmth to oneself after a difficult medical appointment or a painful reminder of physical limitation. Still other days, particularly following the loss of a friend or the receipt of difficult news, the most relevant practice might be the honest contemplation of mortality, sitting quietly with the reality of impermanence rather than pushing it away in fear or distraction. There is no single correct order in which these practices must unfold, and there is no expectation that any person will master all 7 perfectly or permanently. They are, each of them, ongoing practices rather than one-time achievements, requiring patient, repeated return across months, years, and indeed across the entire remainder of a life, however long that life happens to continue. It is worth acknowledging honestly that engaging seriously with these practices, particularly the contemplation of impermanence and death, can initially bring difficult emotions to the surface that may have been suppressed or avoided for years or even decades. This is not a sign that the practices are somehow wrong or harmful. It is often a sign that genuine, honest engagement is beginning to occur, surfacing feelings and fears that had previously been pushed below conscious awareness through busyness, distraction, or simple avoidance. If these emotions become overwhelming, it is entirely appropriate and often genuinely helpful to seek support from a qualified meditation teacher, a therapist familiar with contemplative practices, or a trusted spiritual community, rather than attempting to navigate particularly difficult emotional territory in complete isolation. Buddhist practice, properly understood, has never been intended as a solitary pursuit undertaken without guidance or community support. Throughout history, practitioners have relied upon teachers, fellow practitioners, and structured communities to help navigate the genuine challenges that arise when facing difficult truths about impermanence, aging, and death directly, rather than through the comfortable avoidance that most of surrounding culture actively encourages. There is also great value in approaching these 7 practices with a spirit of patience and self-compassion rather than harsh self-judgment regarding one's own progress or apparent lack thereof. It is entirely common, even among long-term practitioners, to notice moments of fear, craving, resistance, or attachment arising despite years of dedicated practice. This is not evidence of failure. It is simply evidence of being a human being engaged in an ongoing, lifelong process of growth and transformation, a process that rarely, if ever, unfolds in a smooth, linear fashion toward some final state of permanent enlightenment or permanent freedom from difficulty. Rather, most practitioners describe their relationship with these teachings as a spiral, returning again and again to the same fundamental truths, discovering each time a slightly deeper layer of understanding, a slightly greater capacity for equanimity, while also inevitably encountering new challenges and new opportunities for growth that had not been visible at earlier stages of the journey. Consider, as a closing reflection, the particular gift that awaits anyone willing to engage seriously and consistently with these 7 practices across the remaining years of their life, however many or few those years happen to be. This gift is not the elimination of aging itself, an impossible promise that no genuine teaching, Buddhist or otherwise, can honestly offer. The body will continue to change, physical capabilities will continue to shift, generally in the direction of greater limitation rather than greater capacity as the years accumulate. Loved ones will continue, eventually, to pass away, and the practitioner's own life will eventually reach its own conclusion as well, following the same universal law that governs every living being without exception. None of the 7 practices described in this journey change these fundamental facts of existence. What these practices offer instead, and what they have offered to countless practitioners across more than 2,500 years of continuous transmission, is a genuinely different way of meeting these unavoidable facts. A way built not on denial, avoidance, or desperate resistance, but on clear-eyed acceptance, cultivated wisdom, and an open, resilient heart. This different way of meeting the realities of aging does not merely reduce suffering, though it does accomplish this significant benefit. It also, remarkably and perhaps counterintuitively, tends to increase genuine appreciation, presence, and even joy available within whatever years remain, precisely because so much less energy is being consumed by fear, resistance, and the exhausting pursuit of permanence in a universe that offers no such permanence to anyone. Many long-term practitioners, reflecting on their own experience of aging within the context of sustained Buddhist practice, describe their later years, despite genuine physical decline and genuine losses along the way, as among the richest, most meaningful, and most peaceful periods of their entire lives, a description that often surprises younger people who have absorbed, largely unconsciously, the pervasive cultural message that aging represents an unmitigated decline into irrelevance, suffering, and fear. This is not because these practitioners have somehow escaped the genuine difficulties that aging brings. It is because they have learned, through patient, consistent practice, how to meet those difficulties with a quality of presence, wisdom, and inner freedom that transforms the entire experience, not by changing the external circumstances of aging, which remain largely beyond anyone's control, but by fundamentally changing the internal relationship with those circumstances, a relationship that lies, ultimately, entirely within each person's own capacity to cultivate. It can be useful, in cultivating equanimity, to consider the lives of specific figures within Buddhist history who modeled this quality in the face of significant hardship, illness, and eventually death. Many accounts exist within Buddhist tradition of respected teachers who, upon receiving news of a serious illness or the near approach of their own death, responded not with panic or despair, but with a kind of gentle curiosity, continuing to teach, continuing to offer guidance to students, and continuing to model the very equanimity they had spent decades cultivating, right up until their final breath. These accounts are not meant to suggest that such teachers felt no discomfort or difficulty whatsoever. Rather, they illustrate that even significant physical suffering and the direct confrontation with mortality can be met with a stability and presence that remains available to a well-trained mind, a stability that many students of these teachers found more instructive and more moving than any formal lecture on the nature of equanimity could ever have been. Contemporary research in psychology and medicine has, in recent decades, begun to independently confirm much of what Buddhist tradition has taught for millennia regarding the benefits of the practices described throughout this journey. Studies on mindfulness-based interventions have consistently demonstrated measurable reductions in anxiety, depression, and chronic pain among older adults who engage in regular meditation practice. Research on loving-kindness meditation has shown measurable increases in feelings of social connection and reductions in loneliness, a particularly relevant finding given how significantly loneliness affects both the mental and physical health of older populations in many contemporary societies. Studies examining death anxiety have found that individuals who engage in structured, supportive contemplation of mortality, rather than avoiding the subject entirely, often report lower overall anxiety regarding death and greater life satisfaction than individuals who never examine the subject directly. None of this research was necessary for Buddhist practitioners across the centuries to discover the value of these practices through direct experience, but for those inclined toward empirical validation, it is worth noting that modern science, approaching the question through entirely different methods and entirely different cultural contexts, has arrived at conclusions remarkably consistent with teachings first articulated well over 2,000 years ago. It is also worth addressing, with honesty and care, how these 7 practices might be approached by someone currently experiencing significant fear, grief, or distress related to aging. Someone who may feel that calm philosophical reflection is simply unavailable to them in their current emotional state. If you find yourself in this position, know first that this response is entirely understandable and does not represent any kind of failure or spiritual inadequacy. Intense fear and grief are natural human responses to the genuine losses that aging can bring, and no teaching, however wise, should be used as a tool to shame or suppress these authentic feelings. If you are currently in significant distress, the most appropriate first step is often not deep philosophical contemplation, but simple, immediate self-care, reaching out to trusted friends, family members, or professional support, such as a counselor or therapist, ensuring that basic physical needs are being met, and allowing yourself the grace of moving slowly rather than expecting immediate transformation through reading or reflection alone. The 7 practices described throughout this journey are best approached gradually, over time, ideally with support from a teacher, a community, or at minimum, a consistent personal practice sustained across weeks and months, rather than expected to produce instant relief from acute distress. For those approaching these teachings from a place of relative stability, perhaps with some time and space available before the more acute challenges of advanced aging arrive, there is particular value in beginning now, while the mind and body still have considerable capacity for learning new patterns and releasing old ones. Just as it is far easier to learn a new physical skill in earlier years before certain patterns of movement have become deeply ingrained, it is often easier to cultivate new mental and emotional patterns, such as the 7 practices described here, before the acute pressures of significant illness or advanced frailty arrive, demanding immediate adaptation without the luxury of gradual, patient practice. This is not to say that these teachings cannot be taken up later in life, even in the midst of significant illness or in the final months of life itself. Many people have found genuine, meaningful benefit from beginning contemplative practice quite late, sometimes even within the final weeks of their lives, discovering a measure of peace and clarity that had eluded them for decades of avoidance. But there is undeniable wisdom in beginning earlier when possible, allowing these practices the time and repetition needed to become genuinely stable resources rather than unfamiliar tools reached for only in moments of crisis. Reflect for a moment on your own life as it currently stands, whatever your present age and circumstances happen to be. Consider honestly which of the 7 practices described throughout this journey feels most immediately relevant to your own particular situation right now. Perhaps you are currently struggling most with the simple acceptance that your body has changed and continues to change, in which case the first practice, the truth of impermanence, may offer the most immediate and relevant support. Perhaps you are grappling with a recent transition, a retirement, an empty house after children have grown and moved away, in which case the second practice, the practice of letting go, may speak most directly to your current experience. Perhaps you find your mind frequently caught in anxious spirals about the future or painful comparisons to the past, in which case the third practice, the power of mindful presence, offers a direct and practical remedy. Perhaps you are navigating a season of increasing isolation or loneliness, in which case the fourth practice, the path of loving kindness, deserves particular attention and consistent cultivation. Perhaps you have never truly allowed yourself to consider your own mortality honestly, carrying instead a vague, unexamined dread that colors your experience without ever being directly addressed, in which case the fifth practice, making peace with death, may offer the deepest and most transformative work available to you at this stage. Perhaps you notice a persistent restlessness, a sense that satisfaction remains perpetually just out of reach, despite considerable effort and accomplishment across your life, in which case the sixth practice, freedom from craving, deserves careful and honest examination. And perhaps, having engaged with several or all of these practices across a period of sustained effort, you find yourself ready to cultivate the deeper, more integrated stability of the seventh practice, the stillness of equanimity, allowing all that you have learned to settle into a genuine, lived peace that no longer depends on circumstances remaining favorable in order to be sustained. There is one further dimension of equanimity worth exploring before closing this journey, a dimension that touches directly on the relationship between the individual practitioner and the wider community of family, friends, and fellow travelers who are also navigating their own aging process alongside you. Buddhist tradition has always emphasized the value of practicing within community, known traditionally as Sangha, recognizing that even the most dedicated solitary practitioner benefits enormously from the support, encouragement, and shared understanding available within a community of others walking a similar path. This principle holds particular relevance for the specific challenges of aging, since so much of the fear and isolation associated with growing older stems precisely from the sense that one is facing these challenges entirely alone, without others who truly understand the particular texture of what is being experienced. Seeking out community, whether through a meditation group, a spiritual community, a support group for people navigating similar life transitions, or simply a small circle of friends willing to speak honestly about the realities of aging rather than avoiding the subject through polite silence, can significantly support the cultivation of all 7 practices described throughout this journey. There is a particular relief available in speaking honestly with others who share similar fears about physical decline, similar grief about lost friends, similar uncertainty about what the coming years will bring. A relief that comes not from receiving solutions or advice, but simply from being genuinely understood, from discovering that one's own experience, however isolating it may feel internally, is in fact shared by countless others navigating remarkably similar terrain. If such community does not currently exist within your own life, know that seeking it out, whether through a local meditation center, an online community focused on contemplative practice, a religious congregation, or simply a deliberate effort to deepen conversation with existing friends beyond surface-level pleasantries, represents a genuinely valuable investment of time and effort, one that supports every other practice described throughout this journey. Equanimity, properly understood, does not require isolation or withdrawal from relationship. In fact, genuine equanimity, cultivated well, tends to deepen rather than diminish capacity for connection, since a mind less consumed by anxious grasping and fearful resistance has considerably more genuine attention and warmth available to offer to others, and considerably more capacity to receive the support and companionship that others, in turn, are able to offer in return. Consider also the particular value of intergenerational connection during this season of life, connection with people considerably younger than yourself, whether children, grandchildren, younger colleagues, or younger members of a spiritual community. Such relationships offer a valuable counterbalance to the natural tendency, as one ages, to spend increasing time primarily with same-aged peers who share similar physical limitations and similar life stage concerns. Younger people often bring a quality of energy, curiosity, and forward-looking engagement with life that can be genuinely refreshing and clarifying for an older person who may otherwise become increasingly focused on decline, loss, and limitation. At the same time, older practitioners have an enormous amount of wisdom, patience, and hard-won perspective to offer younger people, navigating the anxieties and uncertainties of building their own lives, creating a genuinely reciprocal relationship rather than a one-directional flow of care or attention. As this exploration of the 7 practices draws toward its conclusion, it may be helpful to consider a simple, integrated daily practice that draws upon all 7 teachings simultaneously, offering a practical structure for those wishing to begin incorporating this wisdom into ordinary daily life, rather than treating it as abstract philosophy to be understood intellectually but never actually lived. Consider beginning each day, even before rising from bed, with a brief, honest acknowledgement of impermanence, silently noting that this day, like every day, is temporary and will not come again, and that this simple fact makes the day precious rather than something to be endured or rushed through without attention. Throughout the day, whenever a strong reaction arises, whether frustration, disappointment, or anxious worry, practice pausing briefly to notice the quality of grasping or resistance present in that reaction, and gently practice the letting go described in the 2nd teaching, opening the hands, metaphorically and sometimes literally, around whatever is being held too tightly. Return periodically throughout the day to the simple anchor of breath and body sensation, using ordinary transitions, walking through a doorway, waiting for water to boil, sitting down to a meal, as natural cues for returning attention to present moment awareness rather than remaining lost in anxious mental time travel. Extend genuine warmth, whether through a kind word, a patient response, or simply a few moments of silent loving-kindness practice, both toward yourself and toward at least one other person each day, recognizing that this warmth, offered consistently, becomes an increasingly stable resource over time. Before sleep, consider a brief, gentle reflection on mortality, acknowledging honestly that this day has ended and will not return, that the number of remaining days is unknown, and that this uncertainty, rather than producing dread, can instead produce a quiet gratitude for the day that has just been lived. Notice, throughout the day, moments when craving arises, the desire for something to be different than it currently is, and practice, even briefly, appreciating what is already present rather than immediately chasing after what remains absent. And throughout all of these smaller practices, hold the entire day, with its inevitable mixture of pleasant and unpleasant moments, successes and disappointments, comfort and discomfort, with the settled, spacious steadiness of equanimity, trusting that this steadiness, cultivated patiently over time, becomes an increasingly reliable foundation, regardless of what any particular day happens to bring. It may help, in bringing this exploration to its close, to gather together a handful of traditional images and stories associated with each of the 7 practices, since stories often carry wisdom more deeply and more memorably than abstract explanation alone, lodging themselves in the imagination in a way that pure concept sometimes fails to achieve. Return for a moment to the image offered at the very beginning of this journey regarding impermanence, the candle flame that appears constant but is, in reality, a continuous process of renewal, moment after moment. Carry this image with you the next time you look in a mirror and notice a new sign of age, allowing yourself to see not a damaged version of a once solid self, but simply the next moment in an ever-renewing flame that has never, at any point, been fixed or unchanging. Recall as well the story of the raft, built with effort to cross a river, and then, wisely, set down upon reaching the far shore, rather than carried forward as an unnecessary burden. Let this story remind you, whenever you notice yourself gripping tightly to an identity, a role, or a circumstance that belonged to an earlier season of your life, that the river has already been crossed, and that setting the raft down is not abandonment or failure, but simply wisdom, freeing your hands and your back for whatever the next stretch of the journey requires. Consider again the simple, always available practice of returning attention to the breath, available in any moment, in any circumstance, regardless of what the mind has been anxiously rehearsing about the past or the future. Let the breath serve, throughout the remainder of your life, as a steady and reliable anchor, always present, always accessible, always capable of returning you gently to the only place where life can actually be lived and where peace can actually be found. This single present moment, arising now, and now, and now, again. Remember the practice of extending genuine warmth outward in ever-widening circles, beginning with yourself, extending to loved ones, to neutral acquaintances, to difficult relationships, and finally to all beings everywhere, without exception. Let this practice remind you, whenever loneliness or invisibility threatens to take hold, that connection remains available, not merely through external circumstances that may have changed considerably across the years, but through the deliberate, internal cultivation of a heart capable of generating its own warmth, a warmth that naturally tends to draw genuine connection back toward itself over time. Recall the farmer whose horse ran away, who met each apparent misfortune and each apparent good fortune with the same simple, humble response, maybe, refusing to rigidly categorize the unfolding events of his life as either purely tragic or purely wonderful. Let this story remind you, whenever a new development in your own aging process initially appears as pure misfortune or pure good fortune, to hold that initial judgment loosely, remaining open to the fuller, more complex unfolding of meaning that often reveals itself only with the passage of considerably more time. Consider the traditional teaching on drinking salt water to quench thirst, each sip providing momentary relief while actually intensifying the underlying craving rather than satisfying it. Let this image remind you, whenever you notice the restless pull toward acquiring something new, whether a possession, an achievement, or a desperate attempt to recapture youthful appearance, to pause and honestly examine whether this particular pursuit, based on your own extensive lived experience across many decades, has any realistic prospect of delivering the lasting satisfaction that craving always seems to promise, but so rarely, if ever, actually provides. And finally, recall the image of the mountain, standing steady through the changing seasons, through storm and sunshine alike, its fundamental nature undisturbed by whatever weather happens to be passing through. Let this image serve as your deepest aspiration throughout the remainder of your life, not the elimination of storms, which remain an inevitable feature of any long life fully lived, but the gradual cultivation of a mountain-like steadiness, capable of holding those storms without losing its own fundamental peace, a peace available to you, as it has been available to countless practitioners before you, regardless of your particular age, circumstance, or the number of years that may remain. These 7 images, the flame, the raft, the breath, the widening circle of warmth, the farmer's wisdom, the salt water, and the mountain, are offered not as a final examination to be memorized, but as companions to be carried gently with you, returned to whenever the particular challenges of a given day or a given season call them forward. Trust that even partial, imperfect engagement with these teachings, practiced honestly and consistently over time, produces genuine and meaningful transformation in how the remaining years of your life are experienced, felt, and lived. There is one final consideration worth offering before this exploration comes to its close, a consideration regarding the relationship between these individual, internal practices and the broader external circumstances that inevitably shape any person's experience of aging. Buddhist teaching has never suggested that internal cultivation alone can substitute entirely for practical wisdom regarding physical health, financial security, adequate housing, and access to appropriate medical care. These external circumstances matter enormously, and a compassionate, realistic approach to aging must include genuine attention to these practical dimensions alongside the internal, contemplative practices described throughout this journey. Seeking appropriate medical care, maintaining reasonable physical activity within whatever capacity remains available, ensuring adequate financial planning for the later decades of life, and cultivating supportive living arrangements all represent genuinely important dimensions of navigating aging wisely, dimensions that complement rather than compete with the internal practices explored here. At the same time, it is worth recognizing honestly that external circumstances alone, however favorable, rarely produce lasting peace regarding the process of aging if the internal relationship with change, loss, and mortality remains unexamined and untransformed. Many people with considerable financial resources, excellent medical care, and comfortable living situations continue to experience significant fear and suffering regarding the aging process, precisely because external comfort alone does not address the deeper, internal patterns of craving, resistance, and unexamined fear that these 7 practices are specifically designed to address. Conversely, some individuals facing considerably more difficult external circumstances, limited financial resources, significant physical limitations, or challenging living situations have nonetheless cultivated remarkable internal peace through consistent engagement with contemplative practice, demonstrating that while external circumstances certainly matter and should never be dismissed or ignored, the internal cultivation described throughout this journey offers a genuinely independent and significant source of well-being, available regardless of the particular external circumstances any individual happens to be navigating. This simple daily structure, practiced consistently over weeks, months, and years, gradually transforms these 7 teachings from abstract concepts encountered once in a piece of writing into genuinely lived, embodied wisdom, the kind of wisdom that becomes available not merely in quiet moments of formal meditation, but in the actual, ordinary texture of daily life, including its more difficult moments, its physical discomforts, its losses, and eventually, its final approach toward death itself. This is, ultimately, the entire purpose of Buddhist practice, as it has been transmitted across more than 2,500 years, not to provide an escape from the genuine difficulties of human existence, including the specific difficulties of growing older, but to offer a genuinely different, wiser, and more peaceful way of meeting those difficulties, a way that countless practitioners across countless generations have found to be reliable, accessible, and profoundly transformative, regardless of the particular culture, circumstance, or century in which they happen to be practicing. Whatever combination of these practices speaks most directly to your own current circumstances, know that the path forward does not require perfection, immediate mastery, or the complete elimination of fear. It requires only a willingness to begin, to return again and again to whichever practice feels most relevant on any given day, and to trust, based on the accumulated experience of countless practitioners across more than 2,500 years, that this patient, consistent engagement genuinely transforms the experience of growing older, not by preventing the inevitable changes that aging brings, but by fundamentally changing the quality of presence, wisdom, and peace with which those changes are met. As you move forward from this exploration, whatever stage of life you currently find yourself in, whether facing the first gray hairs of middle age, navigating the more significant transitions of later adulthood, or perhaps sitting with a parent or elder as they navigate their own final years, carry these 7 practices with you not as abstract philosophical concepts to be understood intellectually and then set aside, but as living, practical tools to be tested, applied, and returned to again and again throughout the remainder of your own particular journey. Sit with the truth of impermanence until it becomes not merely an idea, but a lived, embodied understanding. Practice letting go, gently and repeatedly, whenever you notice the familiar grip of clinging arising around some role, relationship, or physical capability that has already begun its natural process of change. Return again and again to the simple, always available anchor of present moment awareness, allowing the breath and body to bring you home whenever anxious thought pulls you into imagined futures or painful memories of the past. Cultivate genuine warmth toward yourself and toward others, recognizing that this warmth, rather than depleting with age, can actually deepen and mature precisely through the accumulated wisdom that only years of lived experience can provide. Face the reality of your own mortality honestly and courageously, not as a morbid preoccupation, but as a genuine pathway toward greater appreciation, clarity, and peace regarding whatever time remains. Notice the restless pull of craving as it arises, examining honestly whether the objects of that craving have ever, in your own actual experience, delivered the lasting satisfaction they seem to promise. And rest, whenever possible, in the settled, spacious steadiness of equanimity, a mountain-like stability that can hold both the storms and the sunshine of a long life without losing its fundamental peace. The fear of growing old, so pervasive in contemporary culture, so rarely examined honestly or directly, need not remain the final word on how you experience the remaining years of your own particular life. There exists, available to anyone willing to engage seriously with these ancient teachings, a genuinely different possibility, a way of meeting age, illness, loss, and eventually death itself, not with terror and desperate resistance, but with the quiet, hard-won peace of someone who has looked directly at the fundamental nature of existence and found there not an enemy to be feared, but simply the truth, ancient and universal, of what it has always meant to be alive. It is worth pausing, before the final words of this journey, to consider how these 7 practices might interact with whatever personal, cultural, or religious background you bring to this exploration. If you already hold a strong faith tradition of your own, whether Christianity, Judaism, Islam, Hinduism, or any other established path, know that these 7 practices need not be understood as requiring you to abandon or replace that existing tradition. Buddhist teachings on impermanence, letting go, presence, compassion, mortality, contentment, and equanimity have, across many centuries, been engaged meaningfully by practitioners of many different faiths who have found that these particular teachings on the psychology of aging and dying complement rather than contradict their own deeply held theological beliefs. If you hold no particular religious or spiritual framework at all, perhaps identifying as secular, agnostic, or simply uncertain about metaphysical questions, know that these 7 practices, particularly as presented throughout this exploration, do not require adopting any specific metaphysical belief about rebirth, karma, or the nature of ultimate reality. They function, at their most basic level, simply as practical psychological tools for meeting the undeniable realities of change, loss, and mortality, with greater wisdom and less unnecessary suffering. Tools that have proven their value across an enormous diversity of cultural and religious contexts, precisely because they address something universal in human experience, rather than something limited to a single particular belief system. Consider also, as you carry these teachings forward, the particular value of returning to this exploration more than once across the coming months and years, rather than treating it as a single encounter to be absorbed once and then set aside permanently. Many people find that revisiting these 7 practices, at different stages of their own aging journey, reveals new layers of meaning and new practical applications that were simply not accessible or relevant during an earlier reading. The person who first encounters these teachings in vigorous middle age may find the contemplation of death particularly abstract and difficult to fully engage with, only to discover, decades later, following a serious health scare or the loss of a close friend, that this same teaching now carries an entirely different weight and relevance, landing with a depth of understanding that simply was not available earlier. There is no failure in this kind of gradual, unfolding engagement with contemplative teaching. It reflects, rather, the natural way that wisdom tends to develop across a human lifetime, deepening and maturing through direct lived experience rather than through a single moment of intellectual comprehension. Finally, consider extending an attitude of genuine patience and kindness toward yourself as you begin, continue, or deepen your engagement with these 7 practices. There is no competition here, no external standard against which your progress should be measured, no timeline by which you are expected to achieve some predetermined state of equanimity or peace. Each person's journey through aging unfolds according to their own particular circumstances, their own particular history, their own particular capacities and limitations. What matters is not perfect execution of these teachings, but honest, consistent, patient engagement, returning again and again to whichever practice feels most relevant, extending compassion to yourself when old patterns of fear and resistance inevitably resurface, and trusting, based on the accumulated wisdom of countless practitioners across more than 2,500 years, that this patient engagement genuinely transforms the experience of growing older into something considerably more peaceful, meaningful, and even joyful than fear alone would ever have allowed you to imagine possible. There is a final practical suggestion worth offering to anyone genuinely wishing to integrate these 7 practices into ordinary daily life, rather than allowing them to remain merely interesting ideas encountered once and then forgotten amid the busyness of ordinary existence. Consider setting aside a small, consistent period of time each day, even as little as 10 or 15 minutes, dedicated specifically to formal contemplative practice, whether seated meditation focused on the breath, a walking meditation through a garden or quiet neighborhood, or simply quiet reflection on one of the 7 teachings that feels most relevant to your current circumstances. This consistency matters considerably more than the particular length or intensity of any single session. A brief daily practice, sustained across months and years, tends to produce far more genuine transformation than occasional, intense sessions separated by long periods of complete neglect. In much the same way that a small amount of water, applied consistently to a plant every single day, produces far healthier growth than an occasional flood followed by long periods of complete drought. Consider also finding, if at all possible, at least one other person with whom these teachings can be discussed honestly and regularly, whether a spouse, a close friend, a family member, or a fellow member of a meditation or spiritual community. Speaking these teachings aloud, sharing genuine struggles and genuine insights with another person who is also engaged in similar contemplative work, tends to deepen understanding considerably beyond what solitary reading or private reflection alone can typically achieve. There is also considerable value in simply being witnessed in this process, having another person who understands what you are attempting to cultivate and who can offer gentle encouragement, honest feedback, and companionship along a path that can otherwise feel isolating, particularly when engaging with subjects, such as mortality, that much of surrounding culture prefers to avoid discussing altogether. If circumstances make formal meditation practice difficult, whether due to physical limitations, cognitive changes, or simply an unfamiliarity with structured contemplative technique, know that these 7 teachings can also be engaged meaningfully through less formal means. Simply reading and reflecting on these ideas periodically, discussing them with trusted friends or family members, journaling honestly about your own experience of aging in light of these teachings, or even listening to this exploration repeated at different points across the coming months and years, all represent genuine and valuable ways of engaging with this wisdom, even without a formal seated meditation practice. The essential ingredient is not a particular technique or a particular level of formal training, but rather an honest, sustained willingness to look directly at the realities of change, loss, and mortality, rather than continuing the widespread cultural pattern of avoidance and denial that leaves so many people unprepared and unnecessarily fearful as these realities inevitably approach. Consider, too, the value of physical practices that support the contemplative work described throughout this journey, recognizing that Buddhist tradition has never viewed the mind and body as entirely separate or unrelated domains. Gentle movement practices, whether traditional walking meditation, gentle yoga adapted to whatever physical capacity remains available, or simply mindful attention brought to ordinary daily movement, such as walking, gardening, or household tasks, can support the cultivation of present moment awareness in ways that purely seated practice sometimes cannot achieve alone. The body itself, aging and changing as it inevitably does, can become not merely an object of fear and resistance, but an actual teacher and companion in this contemplative journey, offering direct, embodied lessons in impermanence, presence, and eventually the release that accompanies death itself. As you consider how to move forward from this exploration, know that there is no single correct starting point, no mandatory sequence that must be followed precisely, and no fixed timeline by which particular results must be achieved. Some readers may feel drawn immediately to the contemplation of death, finding that this particular practice offers the most direct and honest confrontation with their deepest fears. Others may prefer to begin more gently, perhaps with simple mindful breathing, or the cultivation of loving kindness toward themselves, building a foundation of stability and self-compassion before approaching the more challenging territory of mortality directly. Trust your own instincts regarding where to begin, while also remaining open to eventually engaging with all 7 practices over time, recognizing that they function most powerfully, not in isolation, but as an integrated, mutually supporting system, each practice strengthening and deepening the others across the sustained course of a lifetime dedicated, even imperfectly and inconsistently, to this ancient and profoundly valuable work. There is one more thread worth drawing out before this exploration reaches its natural close, a thread concerning the particular relationship between these 7 practices and the experience of gratitude. Gratitude is not always listed among the classical formulations of Buddhist practice in the same explicit way that mindfulness, loving kindness, or equanimity are named and structured, and yet it arises, almost inevitably, as a natural byproduct of engaging seriously and consistently with the 7 teachings described throughout this journey. When impermanence is truly understood, gratitude tends to arise naturally for whatever is currently present, precisely because that presence is recognized as temporary rather than guaranteed. When letting go is genuinely practiced, gratitude tends to arise for whatever remains, once the exhausting grip of clinging to what has already passed has finally been released. When mindful presence becomes a lived habit rather than an occasional technique, gratitude arises simply from the noticing itself, from actually tasting the tea, actually feeling the sunlight, actually hearing the laughter that might otherwise have passed by entirely unnoticed amid a mind lost in anxious thought. When loving kindness is cultivated consistently, gratitude arises for the very capacity to love and be loved, a capacity that does not diminish with age, even as its particular external expressions inevitably change. When death has been faced honestly, gratitude arises, often quite powerfully, for the sheer fact of being alive at all, a fact so easily taken for granted until its temporary nature has been fully and honestly acknowledged. When craving loosens its grip, gratitude arises for what is already sufficient, rather than remaining perpetually focused on what continues to feel lacking or incomplete. And when equanimity settles into a genuine, lived quality of mind, gratitude arises as a kind of background hum accompanying ordinary experience, a quiet appreciation for the entire unfolding of a life, including its difficulties, its losses, and its inevitable conclusion, recognized not as separate obstacles to gratitude, but as integral, inseparable threads within the single, precious, temporary fabric of having lived at all. This natural emergence of gratitude, arising as a byproduct of genuine practice, rather than being forced or manufactured through willpower alone, represents perhaps the clearest evidence available that these 7 teachings genuinely work, that they produce not merely intellectual understanding, but a felt, lived transformation in how the remaining years of life are experienced. Many long-term practitioners report that this quality of gratitude, cultivated gradually and often almost imperceptibly across years of consistent practice, becomes one of the most reliable and cherished companions of their later decades, a quiet undercurrent of appreciation that persists even through genuine difficulty, genuine loss, and the eventual, honest confrontation with their own approaching mortality. It is fitting, perhaps, to close this exploration by returning once more to where it began, with the image of a person standing before a mirror, noticing a face that has changed considerably from what memory expects to see reflected back. Consider returning to this same image now, having engaged with all 7 practices described throughout this journey, and imagine how that same moment before the mirror might unfold differently. The changes are still present, undeniably so. The wrinkles have not vanished. The gray has not disappeared. The body reflected back still carries the honest, accumulated evidence of many years lived. But the internal response to this reflection has, through patient and consistent practice, begun to shift in fundamental and meaningful ways. Rather than the involuntary whisper of fear that so often accompanies this moment, there arises instead, gradually and imperfectly but genuinely, a quieter and steadier voice, one that recognizes impermanence not as an enemy, but as the natural unfolding of a universal law, one that has released its grip on demanding that this particular face remain forever unchanged, one that remains genuinely present to whatever this actual moment contains, rather than lost in comparison to remembered pasts or anxious imaginings of future decline, one that carries warmth toward this aging face, rather than harsh judgment, one that has made honest peace with the eventual ending that this same face, like every face, will one day meet, one that has released the desperate craving to appear otherwise than it actually does, and one that meets this entire reflection, wrinkles, gray hair, changed contours and all, with the settled, spacious steadiness of a mountain that has weathered many seasons and remains, through all of them, fundamentally at peace. This is not a destination reached once and permanently secured, immune from all future doubt or difficulty. It is, rather, an ongoing practice, a continuous returning, a patient cultivation sustained across the remainder of whatever years each person happens to have available. But it is genuinely available to you, right now, regardless of your current age, your current health, your current circumstances, or the particular fears that may have brought you to this exploration in the first place. The ancient wisdom contained within these 7 practices has supported countless human beings across more than 2,500 years in meeting the universal, unavoidable reality of growing older with considerably more courage, wisdom, and peace than fear and avoidance alone would ever have allowed. This same wisdom remains available to you now, waiting patiently to be tested, applied, and gradually, through consistent practice, made genuinely and permanently your own. Before offering the final blessing that closes this exploration, it is worth acknowledging one last time the ordinary, unglamorous nature of how this transformation actually tends to unfold in real human lives, since it can be easy, after encountering an extended discussion of profound teachings such as these, to imagine that genuine peace with aging must arrive through some dramatic singular breakthrough, a moment of sudden enlightenment after which fear disappears completely and permanently. This is rarely, if ever, how the process actually works for most practitioners across most of recorded history. More commonly, the transformation described throughout this journey arrives slowly, through countless small moments of practice, repeated across months and years, through many instances of noticing fear arising and gently, imperfectly, returning attention to the breath, through many instances of catching oneself gripping tightly to some passing circumstance, and slowly, with practice, learning to open the hand a little more easily each time, through many ordinary days in which equanimity feels distant and difficult, followed occasionally by unexpected moments of genuine peace that arrive, almost by surprise, as evidence that the accumulated practice has indeed been having its quiet, gradual effect beneath the surface of conscious awareness. This ordinary, gradual, often unremarkable quality of genuine spiritual practice deserves to be honored rather than viewed as a disappointing failure to achieve some more dramatic transformation. The mountain does not become steady overnight through a single storm survived successfully. It becomes steady through the slow accumulation of countless seasons, countless storms, countless periods of sunshine, and countless periods of snow, each one adding, almost imperceptibly, to a stability that eventually becomes simply and reliably who the mountain is. Trust this same slow, patient, cumulative process in your own engagement with these 7 practices, allowing yourself the considerable grace of imperfection, inconsistency, and gradual unfolding, rather than demanding of yourself an instant mastery that few, if any, genuine practitioners across the long history of this tradition have ever actually achieved. May you walk this path with courage. May you meet each stage of your life, however many years remain, with growing wisdom, growing compassion, and growing peace. And may the fear that so often accompanies the thought of growing old gradually transform, through consistent and patient practice, into a quiet, abiding gratitude for the extraordinary gift of having lived at all, a gift that includes, inseparably and inevitably, the aging, the changing, and eventually the ending that every living being, without exception, has always shared and always will.